The silver tray dropped from her hands. Porcelain shattered across the stone, the sound tearing through the kitchen, and the whole room turned, but nobody caught the worst of it. Her face gone white before a man who had just pushed the door open. He said nothing, only smiled. A smile that never reached his eye. Outside, fog was crawling up off the lake into the stone walls. Lanterns swayed on their hooks, and down the servants' corridor, an old hound lifted his head, hackles rising, and let out a low growl he had never once offered a guest. She knelt for the broken pieces, her hands shook. Blood beaded between fingers still dusted with flour. "Your name," the man said. She gave it. A half-second too fast. And at the end of the corridor, someone had heard every word, standing still, not stepping in, not walking away. Kensworth Hall. Late autumn. The kind of evening where the fog comes up from the lake and settles into the stone like it never wants to leave. Guests were arriving. Carriages on gravel, lanterns swaying. Voices rising and falling in that practiced, polished way rich people talk when they know somebody's listening, and Barron's was gone. Julian Kensworth felt it before he saw it, a gap where a 110-pound hound should have been sitting. Perfectly still. Perfectly obedient. The most disciplined animal on the estate, everyone said so. The stable master said so. The old gamekeeper who'd trained 3 generations of Kensworth hounds said so. Except tonight. Tonight the leash was empty, and the front hall doors were swinging on their hinges like something had flown straight through them. "Baron." "Nothing." "Baron." Julian's voice cracked across the marble floor, and came off the portraits of dead Kensworths, who'd never to chase a dog tog through their own dinner party. He heard footsteps behind him. His mother. He didn't turn. Because there wasn't time. Because the guests were already stepping out of their carriages, already smoothing their gloves, already glancing toward the open doors with that particular curiosity the wealthy reserve for other people's chaos. He ran down the east corridor, past the drawing room where the fire was lit and the good china was laid. And none of it mattered because his dog, his father's dog, technically, though his father had been dead 4 years and some habits just don't transfer ownership properly, his dog had apparently declared war on the entire evening. Servants' passage. Narrow, low ceiling. The kind of hallway built for people carrying trays, not for a duke moving at a dead sprint in his good boots. He heard it before he reached it. Not barking, which was worse because Baron never went silent. Baron announced himself to rooms the way a cannon announces itself to a battlefield. Julian shoved through the kitchen door and stopped. There was Baron sitting perfectly still, tail sweeping the stone floor in slow, contented arcs, head tilted up, staring at a woman like she'd just walked out of a memory he'd been carrying around in his chest for years. A woman with flour on her sleeves. She hadn't moved. Frozen mid-motion, one hand still hovering over the dough on the table in front of her, the other pressed flat against her apron like she was holding something in. Or holding herself together. Julian couldn't tell which. "Bruno," she started. Wait, that wasn't his name. Julian's brain caught up half a second late. Baron. His name was Baron. She'd said something else. Something that started the same but wasn't the same. And she'd caught herself. And now her mouth was closed and her eyes were on the floor and the whole kitchen had gone very, very quiet. "You know my dog," Julian said, not a question. He didn't mean it as a question. But it came out sounding like one anyway because nothing about this made sense and his voice hadn't gotten the memo that he was supposed to sound like a man in charge. "No, Your Grace." Too fast. Which meant yes. He knew liars. He'd grown up around them, the good kind.
The policy parties.
And lie about how much they admire your mother's taste in curtains. This wasn't that kind. This was a different kind of lie. The kind that cost something to tell. "Say his name again." She looked up, first time. Her eyes met his, and there was something in them that wasn't fear, wasn't guilt exactly, something closer to a woman standing at the edge of a cliff deciding whether the fall was survivable. "His name is Baron," she said. "Steady now. Rebuilt. You've had him since he was a pup. He's 16 years old this spring. There's a scar behind his left ear from a fence wire when he was young, all true. All things a kitchen maid 3 weeks into service should have absolutely no way of knowing." Julian looked down at Baron. Baron looked back up at him with the vague, guilty happiness of a dog who has just done something enormous and doesn't understand why the humans aren't celebrating. "Bruno," Julian said quietly. Testing the sound. "You almost called him Bruno." Something moved behind her face, fast. Gone before he could name it. "A mistake, Your Grace." Twice in one sentence isn't a mistake. She didn't answer that. And the silence stretched out long enough that he could hear the party arriving behind him, 3 corridors away. Laughter and violin strings and glasses already clinking. An entire world that had absolutely no idea that in this kitchen right now, A woman with flour on her hands was looking at him like he was a door she desperately did not want opened. "Your Grace," Miss Pruitt's voice from the doorway. Sharp. A rescue thrown like a rope. The guests. Julian didn't move for one more second. Long enough to watch the woman's shoulders drop just slightly when he finally turned toward the door. Long enough to catch Baron do something he had genuinely never done before. Refused to follow. The dinner party happened, somehow. Julian sat through 7 courses and 40 minutes of Lord Ashford, discussing his new stallion in a level just the horse had personally saved his life at some point. And every single time a servant crossed near the doorway, Julian's eyes flicked up, not because he expected her to be one of them. Because he was checking. Which was, he understood clearly and with some irritation at himself, an entirely new behavior. He did not check doorways. He did not track servants. He was a man who had spent 31 years training himself not to notice things that weren't his to notice. "Yours distracted?" Beside him. Voice pitched low, for his ears only, the tone she'd used since he was 9 years old, and she'd caught him not paying attention to his tutor. "I'm fine. You're staring at the door like it owes you money." Across the table, Lady Sophia Kingsley laughed at something Lashford's wife had said. Perfect laugh. Practiced somewhere probably, the way everything about Sophia had been practiced, the tilt of her chin, the exact angle at which she held her wine glass, the timing of her smiles always landing precisely where they do the most good. She was beautiful. He'd never once denied that. Beauty wasn't the problem. The problem was that he could look at Sophia Kingsley for an entire evening and feel roughly what he felt looking at a well-composed painting. Admiration, distance, nothing that moved. His mother had decided sometime around his 28th birthday that this was simply how love worked for men in his position. That the feeling would come later, after the marriage, the way affection sometimes grows between people who've been assigned to each other like furniture assigned to a room. Julian didn't believe that, because he'd watched it fail once already. Up close, for years, his father and mother had married for exactly the reasons his mother now wanted for him: good family, good land, no scandal, no risk, and for a while it had looked like enough. Julian remembered being young enough to believe it. Remembered his parents at breakfast, polite, orderly, 2 people conducting a well-run household together, until he got older. And started noticing the silences. Until he understood that the silences weren't peace, they were distance, worn smooth over 20 years, the way water wears down stone. 2 people who had simply stopped expecting anything from each other and called the absence stability. His father died believing that was normal. Julian had promised himself quietly, years ago, that he would not. Except here he was. 31, unmarried. His mother's patience running thinner every season, and the woman his family had selected sat across the table right now, laughing at exactly the right moment, and Julian felt nothing that he hadn't felt looking at the wallpaper. While 3 corridors away, a kitchen maid with flour on her sleeves had looked at him like the floor might open up. And somehow that was the more honest reaction in the entire house. He went back to the kitchen the next morning. Told himself it was about the dog. Told himself again on the way down the servants' corridor, past the linen room, past the pantry where Mrs. Pruitt was inventorying flour sacks, and gave him a look he chose not to interpret. The kitchen was different in daylight. Loud. Busy. Steam rising off pots, the cook shouting orders, someone chopping something with more violence than the vegetables strictly required. The head cook, a broad red-faced woman named Mrs. Croft, who had run this kitchen for 11 years and answered to nobody, least of all a duke wandering in uninvited, glanced up just long enough to assess whether his presence required her to stop shouting. It didn't, apparently. She resumed immediately its sentence. Something about the fish arriving late from the coast road, and there she was, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Hair pinned back except for one strand that had escaped and fallen across her face, and she kept blowing it away without looking up from her work. An automatic gesture, the kind of thing a person does 100 times a day without thinking about it. Baron was already there, lying in the corner near the hearth like he'd claimed the spot as territory, tail thumping the floor once when Julian entered. Not getting up. Baron apparently had decided that whatever loyalty he'd once owed exclusively to Julian now had competition. Your Grace. One of the undercooks noticing him first, dropping into a hurried curtsy that set off a small chain reaction across the kitchen. Heads turning, hands stilling. That particular ripple of unease that happens when the master of the house appears somewhere he doesn't usually appear. The woman with the flour, Nora, someone had called her. He'd learned that much from Mrs. Pruitt did not stop working. Which was either very brave or very calculated, he couldn't decide which. Carry on, Julian said to the room generally, and watched everyone very obviously fail to carry on, then watched with the stiff, over-careful movements of people performing their jobs for an audience, everyone except her. She kept kneading. Steady rhythm. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. You don't seem nervous. Jup said quiet enough that it was just for her. Should I be your grace? Most people are. Most people haven't already been accused of something. She glanced up. Something dry in her expression, almost amusement. Being frightened twice in 2 days seems excessive. He hadn't expected that, the wit of it, the steadiness underneath the wit. I didn't accuse you of anything. You looked at me like I'd stolen the silver. I looked at you like you knew my dog's real name, and I don't understand how that landed. He watched it land, watched something flicker across her face and get suppressed almost instantly, folded away the same efficient way she folded the dough. Coincidence, your grace. Twice? The world is full of coincidences. Not the kind that make a 16-year-old hound act like he's found something he thought he'd lost. She didn't answer that, went back to the dough. Push, fold, turn. Julian stood there a moment longer than was strictly appropriate for a duke standing in his own kitchen, and then made himself leave, because staying any longer would have required an explanation he didn't have. Over the following days, the household began noticing small things, individually. Things that meant nothing on their own. Mrs. Pruitt struggled over the wording of a formal letter to the estate solicitor one afternoon, sounding out phrases under her breath in the hallway, frustrated, and Nora, passing through with a tray, paused just long enough to say, perhaps in accordance with the terms previously discussed, rather than as we had said before. Mrs. Pruitt reads more formally and kept walking. Mrs. Pruitt stood there a full 10 seconds before she remembered to close her mouth. Then there was the silver. The new footman, young, still learning, had laid the settings wrong for a formal dinner, and nobody had caught it, nobody except Nora. 3 days into her employment, quietly repositioning 2 forks before the senior footman even noticed the error existed. How would a kitchen girl know the proper placement of a fish fork? The senior footman muttered to Mrs. Pruitt, not quite quiet enough, and Mrs. Pruitt didn't have an answer for him, and then the French. Julian heard it himself. Passing the kitchen garden, window cracked for the autumn air, he caught Nora correcting one of the young scullery girls, who was practicing phrases from some cheap phrasebook, trying to impress a visiting lady's maid who claimed fluency she didn't actually have. Non, Nora said gently. Je vous en prie, je vous en prie. The accent wasn't textbook. It wasn't learned from a book careful, it was easy, natural. The kind of French that comes from a childhood spent hearing it, not memorizing it. Julian stood outside that window for almost a full minute. Then walked away before anyone saw him standing there like a man eavesdropping on his own kitchen. He found them together on a Tuesday. Late afternoon light slanting gold through the kitchen garden, the kind of light that makes even ordinary moments look staged, look like something out of a painting somebody hadn't finished yet. Nora crouched near the low stone wall. Baron beside her, head resting against her knee, eyes half closed in the specific bliss of a large dog being scratched at exactly where he wanted to be scratched, the soft white patch under his chin, the one spot he'd never let a stranger touch without a growl of protest. She was slipping him something. A scrap of meat probably stolen from the kitchen stores, and Julian should have said something about that, should have mentioned it to the cook, except he didn't, because he was too busy watching her face. She was smiling. Not the smile she wore for him. Not the careful, measured, servant-facing employer smile that gave nothing away and revealed nothing underneath. This was different, open, unguarded. The kind of smile that belonged to someone entirely unaware they were being looked at. The kind that transformed her whole face into something Julian found himself unable to look away from. He didn't mean to make a sound, but a branch cracked under his boot, or his breath caught, or something, because she turned, and the smile disappeared. Folded away instantly, the same way she erasure of anything soft that might be visible. She stood fast. Your Grace. A curtsy, brief, already retreating toward the kitchen door. Wait. She stopped. Didn't turn around. I didn't mean to interrupt. You were smiling. Pause, her back still to him. Servants are permitted to smile. Not like that now. She turned. And there was something almost dangerous in her eyes. Something that looked like a woman deciding whether to fight or retreat and choosing, at the last second, something in between. What would your Grace have me do? Practice a smaller one? For your comfort? No, too quickly. He heard himself say it too quickly and didn't care. I'd have you do that one more often. Silence. Long enough that Baron, sensing tension he didn't understand, got up and pressed himself between them, tail wagging with the desperate optimism of a dog trying to fix a mood he couldn't name. Nora looked down at the dog, then back up at Julian. I should go, Your Grace, there's bread that needs tending. She left. Julian stood in the garden a long time after she'd gone, turning something new and uncomfortable over in his chest. Something that felt suspiciously like the beginning of wanting a thing he wasn't allowed to want. He told himself, walking back toward the house, that this was simply curiosity. That any reasonable man would find himself preoccupied by a servant who knew things she shouldn't, spoke French she shouldn't have learned scrubbing pots, smiled like she'd been hiding that particular smile for years, and had simply forgotten, for one unguarded moment, to keep hiding it. Curiosity, he told himself. Except curiosity didn't usually keep a man awake past midnight replaying the exact angle of a stranger's mouth. Except curiosity didn't usually make him invent excuses to walk past a kitchen door 4 times in one afternoon, each time telling himself this was the last, each time finding some new reason it wasn't, which was, he supposed, its own kind of answer. He didn't examine it further than that, not yet. There was too much else demanding his attention, his mother's increasingly pointed remarks about Sophia, a tenant dispute in the eastern fields that required his signature by week's end, the ordinary grinding machinery of running an estate that didn't pause simply because its duke had developed an inconvenient fascination with a woman who folded dough like she was solving a puzzle only she could see, but the fascinations stayed anyway. Sat in the back of his mind through every meeting, every letter, every polite exchange with Sophia across the dinner table, patient and unbothered, waiting for whatever came next. Baron escalated his campaign. That was the only word for it. Campaign. Because what else do you call a hound who 3 mornings later slipped into Julian's study while the door was cracked, seized a leather glove off the chair, and disappeared before anyone could stop him? Julian followed the trail of muddy paw prints straight to the kitchen. Found Baron sitting proudly beside Nora's feet, tail sweeping. The stolen glove dropped like a trophy at her boots. He's brought me presents before, Nora said, not quite managing to hide her amusement. A hairbrush, once an entire boot. I believe that one belonged to your stable master. He's never stolen from me before. Perhaps he's decided you have things worth stealing. Julian picked up the glove. Baron watched him do it with the wounded expression of a dog whose gift has just been rejected. He's never behaved like this. Dogs don't lie, Your Grace. She said it lightly. But there was something underneath it, something that made Julian look up sharply. They only ever do what they actually feel. No performance in it. Unlike people, she agreed. And there was a flicker of something there. Something that looked almost like grief, gone before he could ask about it. That evening, Baron refused his supper. The kitchen staff tried everything: fresh meat, a different bowl, the handler summoned specially to coax him into eating. Baron simply sat by the door, staring down the corridor toward the kitchen, immovable until someone finally fetched Nora, and the moment she appeared in the doorway, Baron ate like nothing had ever been wrong. This is disgraceful behavior, Julian told the dog. 3 days later, after Baron abandoned him mid-walk across the east lawn, and was found 20 minutes later lying contentedly outside the kitchen door. You are a duke's hound. You have a reputation to uphold. Baron thumped his tail against the flagstones. Entirely unrepentant, he gazed up at Julian with the particular smugness of a large animal who has correctly calculated that his master's affection outweighs his master's authority by a considerable margin, and settled back down onto the stone with a contented, self-satisfied sigh, as if the entire lecture had simply confirmed something he'd already known for weeks. Nora, arriving with a basket of vegetables from the garden, caught the end of this one-sided lecture and didn't bother hiding her smile this time. Perhaps, she said, he simply knows what he wants. What's that? She looked at him. Really looked, for just a second longer than propriety allowed, and something passed between them that neither of them named. I couldn't say, Your Grace. But her eyes said something different than her words did. And Julian carried that difference around with him for the rest of the day like a stone in his pocket. He stopped pretending eventually that it was about the dog. At first he'd told himself he came to the kitchen for coffee, then for fresh bread. Then, when even he couldn't sustain that particular fiction, he simply started appearing. No excuse offered, none required. The household too well trained to comment on where their duke chose to spend his afternoons.
The servants noticed.
Mrs. Pruitt noticed. Said nothing. But her eyes tracked him every time he passed through her domain, sharp and assessing, the way a woman watches a house she's run for 20 years and knows down to its bones. Nora noticed too. Neither of them said a word about it. But something had begun changing between them in the small accumulating moments. A longer conversation here, a shared look there, the kind of familiarity that builds itself out of repetition, until one day you look up and realize a stranger has become something else entirely. He learned she loved books, discovered it by accident, catching her reading during a quiet hour, a battered volume of poetry balanced on her knee while she shelled peas into a bowl with the other hand, and when he asked what she was reading she recited 2 lines from memory without glancing at the page. You know it by heart. I know a great many things by heart, Your Grace, most of them useless, not useless to me. She's looked up at that, something careful crossing her face. Why would a duke care what a kitchen maid has memorized? Because it's strange, he said honestly, and I find myself unable to stop noticing strange things about you. She held his gaze a moment too long. That sounds like a dangerous habit, Your Grace. Probably. Neither of them looked away first. The horse incident happened the following week. Julian's mare Duchess, an old joke of a name, given to her by his father, and one that had somehow stuck, had been favoring her left foreleg for 2 days, and neither he nor the groom could identify the cause. She walked fine on the flat, trotted fine in the yard. But something was wrong, subtle enough that it kept slipping past them. Nora was crossing the stable yard with a basket of eggs when she stopped. Just stopped, mid-stride, watching the mare being led in a slow circle. There, she said. See how she shortens the stride right before she puts weight down? 3rd step in the pattern every time. The groom looked at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. Julian looked at the horse, watched. Saw nothing at first, and then 3rd step, exactly as she'd said, saw it. A hitch. Barely visible. Something he'd been staring at for 2 days and missed entirely. How? Julian said slowly. Did you see that way with the basket of eggs in your hands? Nora's face did something complicated. Realist says, maybe, that she'd that kind of eye for horses wasn't kitchen taught. Wasn't servant taught at all. I grew up around horses, she said carefully. That's all. Kitchen maids don't usually. I should get these eggs to the cook, Your Grace, before they spoil. She was gone before he could finish the sentence every time. Every single time he got close to the actual question, where did you learn this? Who taught you? Who were you before you were this? She found some graceful exit. A task remembered. A duty suddenly urgent. The conversation redirected so smoothly, he sometimes didn't notice until she'd already disappeared around a corner. It was elegant the way she did it. It was also, he was beginning to understand, deliberate, practiced. The evasions of someone who had spent a very long time learning exactly how to disappear inside a conversation. Which raised the question he kept not asking, because some part of him was afraid of the answer. What was she running from? The confrontation with the senior footman happened on a gray Thursday, and Julian only heard about it afterward secondhand, though the details reached him fast enough that he understood immediately how serious it had actually been. The footman Harmon, an older man who'd served the family for 15 years and considered himself the keeper of the household's proper order, had cornered Nora in the back hallway. You forget your place, he'd told her, loud enough for others to hear, encouraging the Duke's attention like some common. He hadn't finished the sentence because Baron, who had been lying nearby unnoticed, unremarked, the way large dogs sometimes are until the moment they aren't, rose to his feet, slow, deliberate, body gone rigid, a low rumble building somewhere deep in his chest, and Harmon, a grown man, 15 years in service, entirely unaccustomed to being growled at by anything, took an involuntary step backward. Julian arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, and found the scene already resolving itself. Harmon pales and stammering an apology. Baron still positioned squarely between him and Nora like a wall made of muscle and teeth, and Nora herself standing very still, chin lifted, refusing to look smaller than the moment required Harmon. Julian's voice came out colder than he intended. My study now. The footman fled. Julian turned to Nora. Are you hurt? No, Your Grace. A pause, startled. Not hurt. He crouched, one hand resting on Baron's neck, feeling the tension still coiled there, the dog's whole body still angled protectively toward her. He's never done that. Not once. Not for anyone. He seems fond of me. He seems willing to bite a man for you. She let out a small, surprised laugh at that, quickly smothered, as though laughter itself felt like a risk she hadn't budgeted for. You're allowed to laugh, Julian said. I won't report it to the household as improper conduct. I'll take that under advisement, Your Grace. He straightened, glanced down the hallway where Harmon had fled, then back at her. I'll see to it he doesn't trouble you again. Whatever else is true or untrue about you, that behavior was unacceptable regardless. Thank you, though I suspect Baron had the matter rather well in hand before you arrived. Baron doesn't have the authority to dismiss a footman. No, Eleanor agreed, something dry creeping back into her tone now that the danger had passed. But he does apparently have the authority to terrify one into silence, which is in its own way a more efficient form of justice. Julian found himself smiling despite the tension still coiled in his shoulders. I'll remind you that's my staff you're describing so uncharitably. I'm describing your dog, Your Grace. Your staff simply happened to be standing in the way of his opinions. Something shifted in her expression. Not fear this time. Something closer to being properly seen for the first time in a very long while. Thank you, she said quietly. For not letting that continue. Baron, you came. 3 words, simple. But there was weight in them, a whole history behind them that Julian couldn't access. And for a moment neither of them said anything else. Standing in the narrow hallway with a dog between them like a chaperone neither of them wanted. She looked at him differently after that. Not as Duke, issuing orders. As a man who had crossed the house at a dead sprint the moment he'd heard trouble in her direction, and hadn't stopped to think about how that would look. Neither of them said anything more. But something had shifted. Quietly, permanently. That night, alone in her narrow room above the kitchen, Nora drew a silver pendant from beneath the collar of her nightdress. She hadn't looked at it in days. Sometimes weeks passed between the moments she let herself take it out, unclasp the small hidden catch, hold it in her palm like something that might burn her if she wasn't careful. A crowned stag. Beneath 3 stars. She traced the engraving with her thumb, the metal worn smooth in places from years of exactly this being held, hidden, held again. A habit that predated everything about her current life. A habit from a girl who used to have a different name. She remembered her mother fastening it around her neck for the first time, remembered the particular weight of it, unfamiliar then, and remembered her mother saying that a winterborn woman never removed it. Not for anything, not for anyone, a small piece of advice that had, in the years since, become the truest thing anyone had ever told her. The doorway creaked. She looked up. Baron, having somehow slipped past Mrs. Pruitt's careful nighttime rounds, ears forward, body still. He stared at the pendant. Not at her, at it. And then slowly, like something in him had cracked open, he let out a sound she'd never heard him make before. Low. Aching. A whine that seemed to come from somewhere much older than tonight. Nora's hand closed around the pendant, fast, protective. Her eyes filling before she could stop them. You remember, she whispered. Barely sound at all, you actually remember. Baron crossed the small room and pressed his head against her knee. The same gesture he'd made in the garden. The same trust offered so easily and so completely. And Nora understood, sitting there in the dark with her hand wrapped around a piece of silver that connected her to everything she'd buried, that Baron's devotion to her had never started here. Not in this kitchen, not 3 weeks ago. Whatever this dog remembered, whatever pulled him toward her with a certainty he couldn't explain and she wasn't ready to, it had begun somewhere else entirely. Somewhere she'd worked very hard to make sure nobody at Kensworth Hall would ever find. The evening that changed things happened almost a week later. Late. The household quiet, most of the staff already retired. The kind of hour when a great house stops performing itself and just exists, creaking, settling, breathing. Julian found her alone in the kitchen, working by lamplight, shaping pastry with the quick, practiced movements of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, hands dusted white. One strand of hair escaped again and hanging loose against her cheek. No Baron this time, no servant hovering. No convenient excuse for either of them. You should be asleep, she said without looking up. So should you? I'm working. My own house. That got her attention. She glanced up. Something curious in her expression. Avoiding what exactly? Julian pulled out a stool, sat, uninvited, across the work table from her, and for a long moment, move, fold, press, turn, the same rhythm he'd watched a dozen times now without ever getting tired of it. Do you know what it's like, he said slowly, to envy an ordinary man? She looked up, waited. A man who can choose a wife because loves her. Not because a title requires an heir, not because a marriage settlement needs a certain acreage attached to it. He shook his head. I've never once been permitted to something simply because I wanted it. Nora set down the pastry knife. That sounds lonely, Your Grace. It's expected. Which is worse somehow. Loneliness that everyone considers correct. She studied him for a long moment, and when she spoke, there was something in her voice he hadn't heard from her before, not caution. Not the careful distance she usually kept, something closer to honesty. I don't understand why a title should forbid a man from choosing his own happiness. Because a title isn't really mine, it's the estate's, the tenant's. My mother's, in some sense she gave up her own life for it and expects the same of me. That's not the same as being forbidden, isn't it? No, firm, certain. It sounds to me like everyone around you is so frightened of the title that they've forgotten there's a man underneath it. Julian went very still, because nobody had ever said that to him before, that plainly. Not that directly. His whole life had been an elaborate structure, people managing him, guiding him, reminding him of duty, and here was a kitchen maid, 3 weeks into her employment, cutting straight through all of it with a sentence. "No one talks to me the way you do," he said quietly. "Is that a complaint, Your Grace?" "It's the opposite of a complaint." Something passed between them then, charged, unmistakable. The kind of silence that exists right before two people, something they've both been avoiding. "Do you fear me?" he asked, quiet enough that it barely disturbed the air. She hesitated. Genuinely hesitated. And he watched her decide, in real time, how honest to be. "Sometimes because you could destroy my whole life without meaning to. With one careless word. One assumption. Men in your position rarely understand how much power is in their smallest gestures." "You wouldn't mean to." He was about to answer, about to say something he hadn't fully formed yet. Something true. Something that might have changed everything right there in that quiet kitchen when footsteps sounded behind them. Both of them turned. Lady Sophia Kingsley stood in the doorway. One glance. That was all it took. One glance around the kitchen, the late hour, the empty room, the closeness of the two figures at the work table, and Sophia understood something Julian very much did not want her to understand. The warmth drained out of her face. "Well," Sophia said, her voice pitched with careful, deliberate control. "This is a surprise." Nora rose immediately, stepped back from the table, hands folding in front of her apron, the posture of a servant reasserting distance she'd allowed to collapse. "Lady Sophia," she said, looked at Julian. "I came looking for you. Your mother was concerned." "I'm perfectly well." Sophia's gaze finally shifted to Nora, cold and precise. Servants who forget the distance between themselves and their employers rarely remain employed for very long. "I'd think about that if I were you, Sophia." Julian's voice sharper than he intended. "I'm simply being honest, Julian. Someone should be. She's done nothing wrong. She's alone with you at midnight, kneading pastry like it's an intimate act. I think most reasonable people would consider that something." Nora said nothing. Stood very still, eyes down, weathering it the way Julian suspected she'd weathered a great many things before he'd ever known her, quietly, without giving anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. And something in him snapped. "That's enough." Sophia blinked. "Not used to being addressed that way." "I beg your pardon?" "She's a member of this household. You'll speak to her with the respect that deserves, or you'll leave my kitchen." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Sophia's face went through several expressions in quick succession: shock, then something colder, then a careful practiced smoothness that Julian recognized as the mask she wore whenever she'd decided a battle wasn't worth losing composure over. "Of course," she said finally. "Forgive me, it's late and I'm tired and I misspoke." She left without another word. The kitchen felt very quiet after the door closed. Julian turned to Nora. "I'm sorry, you don't need to apologize for her. I'm apologizing for how fast that was. How fast someone can decide what you are based on nothing." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "I did. That was fast too, Your Grace." He almost laughed. Almost. There wasn't quite room for laughter in the moment. Not with the aftertaste of Sophia's coldness still hanging in the air. But something lighter passed between them anyway. Some acknowledgement that they'd both just watched him do something neither of them had expected. "It surprised me too," he admitted. His mother found him the next morning. Not in the breakfast room. In his study, where he'd retreated with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, staring at estate papers he wasn't reading. The Dowager Duchess closed the door behind her. A deliberate gesture. The kind that meant this conversation wasn't for servants' ears. "Sophia came to me last night. I assumed she would. You defend a kitchen maid in front of a woman your entire family expects you to marry." "I defended a person from unkindness. That's not the same thing as a declaration." His mother crossed the room, sat across from him, folding her hands this way she always did when she was about to say something she considered both difficult and necessary. "Julian, I'm not blind. I've watched you find reasons to be in that kitchen for 2 weeks. I've watched the way you speak about her when you think no one's listening." "Nothing has happened, Mother." "I didn't say it had." Her voice softened, unexpectedly. "I'm saying that affection for a servant is a dangerous thing to let grow, even quietly. Especially quietly. Because gossip doesn't wait for permission, and gossip involving a duke destroys the woman far more easily than it damages him." Julian looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if this continues, if the people begin to talk, and they will, they already have, it won't be your reputation that suffers. You'll weather it fine. Dukes always do." She paused. "It's her who'll be ruined. Dismissed without reference. Unemployable in any respectable house in the country. That is the entire weight of what you're risking, and I don't think you've considered it. Julian sat with that, felt the full, uncomfortable truth of it settle into his chest. He hadn't considered it. Not properly. He'd been so caught up in the strangeness of Nora, the mystery of her, the pull toward her, that he'd never once stopped to weigh what his own attention might cost her. I understand, he said quietly. Do you? I'll be more careful. His mother studied him. Careful is not the same as stopping, Julian. And I suspect you already know which one you're actually choosing. She left without waiting for him to argue. Julian sat alone with his cold coffee for a long time afterward, turning her words over, feeling for the first time the full weight of what he'd started without meaning to, and understanding that he still, despite everything, had no intention of stopping. He thought, sitting there, about his father's own marriage. About the particular silence that had settled over that house long before he was old enough to name it. His mother wasn't wrong to warn him, he understood that. She had lived inside a version of exactly the caution she was now urging on him, had built an entire life around the belief that safety mattered more than wanting something recklessly. And she had been miserable for most of it. Julian didn't say that to her. There was no kindness in saying it, and no use either. She had made her peace with the life she'd chosen decades ago, the way people generally do, by deciding retroactively that the choice had been the only sensible one available. But he understood, sitting alone with his cold coffee, that he did not intend to make the same peace. Whatever risks Nora represented to reputation, to the tidy machinery of duty, his whole life had been built around. The alternative was a version of his father's marriage. Polite, orderly, entirely hollow. He'd rather risk the scandal. Lord Reginald Voss arrived 3 days later. Unannounced. More or less a letter had come ahead of him by only a day, citing some vague business regarding a shared acquaintance and requesting a night's hospitality on his journey north. Julian's mother knew the family name distantly, some connection 2 generations back, and extended it without much thought. He arrived in the late afternoon, tall, precisely dressed. The kind of man who smiled with his mouth and left his eyes entirely out of the arrangement. Julian didn't think much of him initially. Just another minor lord passing through. The kind of guest the house absorbed and forgot within a week until the kitchen. Voss had wandered claiming curiosity about the estate's famous gardens, though the route he'd taken made little sense for that purpose, down the servants' corridor, and pushed open the kitchen door at precisely the moment Nora was crossing the room with a laden tray. She saw him. The tray hit the floor, porcelain shattering, silver scattering. A sound loud enough that half the kitchen turned, and in the sudden silence that followed, Julian, who happened to be passing the corridor at that exact moment, drawn by some instinct he couldn't name, saw something pass across Nora's face that he had never seen there before. Not embarrassment at the broken tray. Terror, pure, unguarded, bone-deep terror, gone almost as fast as it appeared, replaced by the careful blankness she wore for strangers. Voss stood frozen in the doorway. Something flickering across his own expression, recognition, unmistakable, a man seeing a ghost in broad daylight, and trying very hard to convince himself he hadn't. Forgive me, Nora said quickly, already dropping together broken, her voice pitched perfectly steady, speech everything Julian's had just seen underneath it. Clumsy of me. Your name, Voss said. Quiet, careful, Nora, my lord, Nora Wren. He repeated it. Slowly, like a man testing whether a lie could hold its shape under pressure. Wren, yes, my lord. Voss said nothing else. But he didn't look away either, studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. The kind of look that catalogs a face, memorizes it, files it away for later use, and then, finally he turned and left the kitchen without another word. Nora remained kneeling on the floor. Motionless. Broken porcelain scattered around her like something out of a nightmare she'd apparently been expecting for a very long time. Julian crossed the room, crouched beside her. Nora. She flinched at his touch on her arm, then caught herself, forced her hands steady, forced her breathing even. I'm fine, Your Grace. You are not fine. You went white as that broken china the second he walked in. It was startling, that's all. That was not startling, that was recognition. He kept his voice low, gentle, but there was no softening the question underneath it. He knows you. Or thinks he does, and whatever that means. It frightened you more than anything I've seen frighten you yet. She didn't answer. Baron appeared in the doorway just then, drawn perhaps by whatever chaos had briefly filled the room, and crossed straight to Nora, pressing his whole weight against her side. The same instinctive protection he'd offered outside. The same fierce, wordless loyalty. Nora buried one hand in his fur, steadying herself against him rather than against Julian, and Julian noticed that, filed it away without quite understanding what it meant yet. You should rest, he said finally. When it was clear she wasn't going to explain, wasn't going to give him anything more than she already had. "I'll have someone clean this, thank you, Your Grace." She rose, straightened her apron, composed herself into something that resembled calm, though Julian could see the effort it cost her, the visible work of reassembling a person who'd nearly come apart in front of him. He watched her go. And that night, long after the household had gone quiet, Julian sat alone in his study with a single candle burning low, turning over everything he'd witnessed in the past 3 weeks: the French she shouldn't know, the silver placement she shouldn't recognize, the horse's gait she shouldn't have caught, the pendant Baron had reacted to with a whine that still echoed strangely in his memory even though he'd only heard about it secondhand, and now this. A stranger's face, a dropped tray, a terror too large for a broken piece of china to explain. Beneath the flower and the apron and the careful, practiced deference, there was a woman with an entire life Julian knew nothing about. A life someone Lord Reginald Voss, whoever he actually was to her, had apparently followed her into this house to find. Julian didn't sleep much that night. He lay awake turning over every strange thing he'd witnessed in the past 3 weeks, and found himself, somewhere past midnight, thinking not about the mystery of her at all, but about the particular ache of watching someone hide in plain sight. He'd grown up in a house full of people who performed contentment for each other. His parents at breakfast, his mother at every dinner party, himself, more often than he cared to admit in front of Sophia. He recognized the shape of that performance when he saw it in someone else. Nora Wren performed it better than anyone he'd ever met. Which meant, he understood, lying there in the dark, that whatever she was protecting herself from had taught her that lesson far more thoroughly than a lifetime of polite society had ever taught him. He kept thinking about the way she'd said her own name, Nora Wren. The way it had come out just a fraction too fast. The way Voss had repeated it like he was testing a door he already suspected was locked from the wrong side. Whatever her real name was, Julian understood, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, while somewhere below him a hound kept restless watch outside a kitchen door. Whatever her real name was, it was about to matter a great deal more than either of them was ready for, because Reginald Voss had not come to Kensworth Hall by accident, and Julian was beginning to suspect that whatever he'd come looking for, he had just found it. He watched Voss across the dinner table the following evening, and found himself doing something he had never once bothered doing with a guest before. Counting how many times the man's eyes drifted toward the kitchen doorway whenever a servant passed through with a dish. Counting the seconds his gaze lingered on the doorway after the servant had already gone. Counting the careful, unhurried way he steered every ordinary conversation, the weather, the roads, the state of the harvest, back around, eventually, to the household staff. "You keep a large kitchen," Voss observed, cutting into his pheasant with unnecessary precision. "More hands than I'd expect for an estate this size." "My father believed in running a comfortable house," Julian said. "And do you verify your own staff personally, Your Grace? References, backgrounds, that sort of thing? Or does the housekeeper manage all that?" "Mrs. Pruitt has run this household for 2 decades. I trust her judgment completely." "How convenient." Voss smiled with his mouth. Nothing in his eyes moved. A duke who never has to look too closely at who's actually in his own kitchen. Julian set down his fork. "Is there a reason you're so interested in my staff, Lord Voss?" "Only idle curiosity, Your Grace. A man travels enough on roads, he starts noticing patterns in how great houses are run. Some dukes' kitchens are full of strangers nobody's bothered to properly account for." He took a slow sip of wine. "It's a wonder more of you aren't robbed blind." "I've never once felt robbed in my own house." "No," Voss agreed, and something in his voice went very quiet, very deliberate. "I don't suppose you have yet." Julian held his gaze across the table, refused to blink first, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of seeing anything land. But underneath the table his hand had curled into a fist against his knee, and he understood, watching Voss return calmly to his pheasant as though nothing at all had passed between them, that the man was not merely fishing anymore, he was warning him. Julian excused himself early that night, claiming estate business, and did not sleep. The letters had the study for 4 years, sealed, untouched, stacked in a drawer Julian rarely opened because opening it meant remembering his father was actually gone, not just away somewhere. Not just delayed at the London house the way he used to be for months at a time. But something Voss's face had done in that kitchen doorway kept picking at him. Wouldn't let him sleep. Wouldn't let him sit through breakfast without his mind wandering 3 rooms away to a locked drawer he'd been avoiding since the funeral. So he opened it. Because avoiding a thing doesn't make the thing stop existing. He'd learned that much, if nothing else, in 4 years of pretending a whole drawer of his father's correspondence wasn't Dust, first then paper. Dozens of letters, tied in bundles by year, his father's handwriting cramped and slanting the way it always got when he wrote late at night by candlelight. Julian sat at the desk. Started reading. Estate business. Mostly it's a long correspondence with a wine merchant in France that went on for 11 letters, and never once resolved anything. Nothing. 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 Until a name stopped him cold. Winterbourne. He read it twice. Made sure his eyes weren't inventing something out of exhaustion and coffee, and 3 sleepless nights spent turning Reginald Voss's face over in his memory. Winterbourne. The letter was old. 15 years, maybe more. The paper gone soft and yellow at the folds. His father's hand, but younger, steadier, less cramped. The writing of a man who hadn't yet learned what it felt like to run an estate alone. My dear Edmund, I received your letter with considerable relief. Vane's duct grows more troubling by the season, and I confess I do not trust him with the affairs you've entrusted to his management. You know my feelings on the matter. You have known them for years, and yet you continue to extend him rope enough to hang the both of you. Julian stopped. Vane, not Voss. He read the name 3 more times, certain it was a trick of tired eyes, certain the ink would rizzle itself into something else if he just looked hard enough. It didn't. Which meant nothing yet. Which meant everything, possibly, except he couldn't see the shape of it clearly enough to know which. He kept reading. I have told you plainly, and I will tell you again, though I know you tire of hearing it, a man who was denied his birthright does not simply set the grievance down because 30 years have passed. Grievance does not age the way men do, it only waits. Send Eleanor to us if matters grow worse. We would be glad of the company, and I have grown fond of the girl in a way that surprises even me. There is something in her that reminds me of you at that age. Stubborn, sharp, entirely too clever for her own comfort. Julian's hand went still on the page. Eleanor. He read the name again and again, because his mind was already doing something dangerous, something that felt like a door swinging open in a house he thought he knew completely, revealing a hallway that had apparently been there the whole time, just never lit. Nora Wren doesn't exist, he thought. Not really. Never did. He sat with that a long moment, let it settle into his chest, the way cold settles into a room when a window's been left open too long. Because if the letter was talking about the same Eleanor, and something in his gut, something old and instinctive, told him it was then the woman folding pastry in his kitchen at midnight, the woman who knew French she shouldn't know, and silver placement she shouldn't recognize, and a horse's gait she shouldn't have been able to read from 30 away, that woman had a father who'd written to his father, which meant his own father had known her, which meant Julian forced himself to stop, to breathe. Because his thoughts were running somewhere he wasn't ready to follow yet, sprinting ahead of the actual evidence sitting in front of him, and he needed to slow down before he built an entire castle out of 2 names in a 15-year-old letter. He kept digging, found more. A whole correspondence spanning years, between his father and a man named Edmund, no surname given not once, which was itself strange. The kind of caution 2 men use when they don't fully trust the discretion of whoever might read their letters after them. Business discussed in careful language. Numbers. Land, and running underneath all of it a warning that repeated itself in slightly different words across a dozen letters. Vane cannot be trusted with the accounts. Vane grows bolder each year you allow him access. You are too generous with a man who has spent his whole life believing he was owed more than you gave him. Julian read until the candle burned down to a stub and the gray edge of morning started creeping in around the curtains. And somewhere in that long sleepless reading, he found the letter that changed everything. Dated less than a year before his father's own death. The handwriting shakier than the earlier letters, his father, older now, tired, the strength going out of his hand the way it goes out of a man's body long before anyone notices. Edmund, I have thought a great deal about the promise we made each other all those years ago when we were young enough to believe our word was worth more than our land. You held the door open for me once when my own family thought me unfit to inherit. I have never forgotten it. I do not intend to start now. If anything should happen to you, and I say this only because a man my age has learned not to assume tomorrow is guaranteed to anyone, you have my word. Whatever needs protecting I will protect. Whoever needs shelter my house will shelter them. This is not charity, old friend. This is debt, and I intend to pay it however long it. I have also asked that the pup from this year's litter be sent to us at Kensworth as we discussed. If matters at Winterbourne ever turn as dark as you fear, better the animal grow up here where no creditor's man can lay a hand on him. Your Eleanor and my son have never met, I think, though they are near enough in age that fate may yet correct that oversight. Perhaps someday. Julian sat back. stared at his own name not written directly, but implied plainly enough on a page his father had written before either of them was old enough to understand what a promise like that could cost a family. You're Eleanor and my son, the pup from this year's litter. Julian closed his eyes, because the pieces were arranging themselves now faster than he wanted them to, and he understood with a kind of sick, falling certainty exactly who Nora Wren actually was, and exactly why a hound born at Winterbourne Manor had spent the last 16 years of his life at Kensworth Hall, sent here as a pup for safekeeping, years before the danger his father had already sensed ever fully arrived. Not a kitchen maid, not a mystery to be solved for his own idle curiosity. His father's promise unfulfilled, sitting in his own kitchen wearing an apron and calling herself by a name that wasn't hers. And somehow through some cruelty of timing, neither of them had chosen. Julian's father had died before he could ever make good on the debt he swore to pay, which left the debt to Julian, whether he wanted it or not. He didn't sleep at all that night. By morning he'd read every letter in the drawer twice, cross-referenced dates against what little he actually knew about Nora's arrival at the estate, and arrived at a single, unshakable conclusion. His father had known Edmund Winterbourne for decades, had promised him protection, had promised shelter for his family should the worst ever happen, had even taken in the family's own hound as a pup, years before the worst arrived, as though some part of him had already known it was coming, and the worst had happened. Julian just didn't know the shape of it yet. He found Mrs. Pruitt in the linen room, sorting through an inventory with the brisk efficiency she brought to everything, and closed the door behind him before he spoke. She looked up. Something in his face must have told her this wasn't ordinary business, because she set down the ledger immediately and gave him her full attention. Your Grace, how long have you served this household? 22 years, Your Grace, since before you were born. Did you know my father corresponded with a man named Edmund Winterbourne? Her face did something small and quick, a flicker, gone almost before he caught it, and Julian understood, watching it happen, that this was not a name Mrs. Pruitt was hearing for the first time. I knew of the correspondence, Your Grace, I never read it, but you knew the name. Everyone in the old household knew the name at one point. There was talk, years ago. She hesitated. Before you'd have been old enough to remember it. Talk about what? Mrs. Pruitt's hands folded in front of her apron, a gesture Julian had come to recognize. She did it when she was deciding how much truth a person deserved. There was a great scandal, Your Grace. The Winterbourne estate. A daughter who died in some accident not long after her father passed. I don't recall the particulars. It was a distant sort of tragedy, the kind that happens to families we don't dine with, and I confess I never paid it the attention I probably should have. A daughter. Yes, Your Grace, do you recall her name? Mrs. Pruitt studied him for a long moment. Something careful in her expression now. Something that looked almost like she was weighing whether to say the thing she already suspected he wanted her to say. Eleanor, I believe. Lady Eleanor Winterbourne. Julian felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, even though he'd already half guessed it, even though the letter upstairs already had the name written plainly enough. Hearing it confirmed by another voice made it real in a way the paper alone hadn't quite managed. Mrs. Pruitt. His voice came out lower than he intended. I need you to think very carefully before you answer this next question. Your Grace? Does Nora Wren remind you of anyone? The silence stretched long enough that Julian could hear the clock ticking somewhere down the hall, could hear his own pulse in his ears, could hear everything except the answer he was waiting for. I've wondered, Mrs. Pruitt said finally. Quiet, careful. I've wondered from the first week, Your Grace. The way she carries herself. The way she speaks when she forgets to guard it. I told myself I was imagining things. You know, I don't believe I was. He needed proof. Not suspicion. Not the trembling half-certainty of two people comparing memories that might mean nothing. Might just be coincidence, dressed up as significance, because they both wanted it to matter. Proof. Julian rode to the county solicitor's office the next morning, alone, telling no one where he was going or why. Because if he was wrong about this, if he was chasing ghosts through 15-year-old letters and building an entire narrative out of nothing, he did not want the whole household watching him fail at it. The solicitor, a stooped, careful man named Whitmore, who'd handled Kensworth business for 30 years, knew the Winterbourne name the moment Julian said it. Terrible business, Whitmore said, shaking his head, settling into the particular tone men use when discussing old tragedies they witnessed from a comfortable distance. The Earl dead within months of his wife. Debts nobody could quite account for, and then the daughter gone in that carriage accident before anyone could sort out what had actually happened to the estate. Who managed the affairs after the Earl died? A cousin, I believe. distant relation. Took over the administration once it became clear the daughter. He stopped himself. Forgive me, it's an old story, Your Grace. I don't recall every particular. Do you recall the cousin's name? Whitmore frowned, searching. Vane, I believe, felt something cold settle into his chest. Vane, he repeated. Not Voss. I couldn't say, Your Grace, it was 15 years past, and I only heard the story secondhand from a colleague who handled some small piece of the estate transfer. Could a man change his name? Legally? Whitmore's eyebrows rose. With the right documentation and enough money to smooth the process, a man can call himself nearly anything he likes, Your Grace. It's not common, but it isn't impossible. Julian sat with that for a long moment, staring at nothing, feeling the shape of the whole thing assembling itself in the space behind his eyes. Reginald Vane. Cousin to the Winterbourne family. Present when the debts appeared. Present when the daughter's carriage went off the road. Present now, at Kensworth Hall, wearing a different name and looking at a kitchen maid with an expression that could only be described as recognition. I need everything you have on the Winterbourne estate transfer, Julian said. Every document. Every ledger. However long it takes. Whitmore studied him. May I ask why, Your Grace? 'Cause I think a man got away with something 15 years ago. And I think he's currently a guest in my house. The old solicitor removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly on his sleeve, the small ritual of a careful man buying himself a moment to decide how much of his own long-buried doubt he was finally ready to voice aloud. Whitmore's face changed slowly, the professional caution of 30 years in practice giving way to something more personal. There was another matter, Your Grace, if I'm honest with myself about it. Something that never sat right. All those years ago, though I hadn't the standing to say so at the time. He rose, moved to an old cabinet along the far wall, and withdrew a slim file. See junior counsel then. Barely permitted to speak in the room where the estate transfer was finalized. But I recall the physician's report. The one confirming Lady Eleanor's death. What about it? It was signed a full week after the accident, Your Grace. A week. For a body that was never, so far as I could determine, actually recovered from the river below that embankment. Whitmore set the file on the desk between them, his hands not entirely steady. I raised the question once quietly to my senior partner. I was told the matter was settled and it was not my place to reopen grief for a grieving family. I was young. I let it go. I have regretted letting it go for 15 years, Your Grace, though I confess I never once imagined I might someday have the chance to correct it. Julian opened the file. Read the physician's signature, the date, the careful official language declaring a young woman deceased on evidence that amounted, on close reading, to almost nothing at all. You kept this. I keep everything, Your Grace. It is, I've found, the only advantage a small man has over a powerful one. Powerful men assume the documents took 2 days to gather. 2 days during which Julian barely slept, barely ate, barely managed the ordinary courtesies of hosting Voss Vanes. He corrected himself now every single time, refusing to let the false names settle comfortably in his mind anymore, while the man sat at his dinner table each evening smiling with his mouth, eyes empty as ever. Julian watched him differently now. Watched the way Voss's gaze tracked toward the kitchen doorway whenever a servant passed through. Watched the careful, patient way he asked questions about the household staff. How long had they been employed? Where had they come from? Did the Duke verify references personally or leave that task to the housekeeper? Fishing. That was the only word for it. A man fishing for confirmation of something he already suspected, testing the water carefully so as not to spook whatever he was hunting. Julian gave him nothing, but he watched. And he waited, and late at night, alone in his study with Whitmore's borrowed ledgers spread across his desk, he built the case one document at a time. The debts had appeared suddenly. 6 months after the Earl's death, a series of loans surfaced in the estate account, sums borrowed against the land, signed by Edmund Winterbourne himself, dated in the final year of his life. Except the signatures were wrong. Julian wasn't a handwriting expert, but he'd read enough of the real Edmund Winterbourne's correspondence, now a dozen letters, all in the same careful, slanting script, to recognize immediately that the signatures on the loan documents didn't match. Close. Close enough to fool a casual glance. Not close enough to fool a man who'd spent 2 sleepless nights studying every curve of the real thing. Forged, he thought all of it. And once the debts existed on paper, everything else followed with a horrible mechanical logic. Creditors arrived, demanding payment against sums the Earl had never actually borrowed. Land was sold to cover debts that didn't exist. Servants dismissed as the estate's finances collapsed under weight that had been manufactured from nothing. All of it managed by Reginald Vane. All of it benefiting Reginald Vane, whose own name appeared again and again as the recipient of payments drawn against the very debts he'd apparently invented. Julian sat back in his chair as the full shape of it settled over him like something physically heavy. This wasn't a distant cousin managing a grieving family's affairs. This was theft. Deliberate, patient, carefully executed theft, dressed up in enough legal paperwork to survive scrutiny for 15 years. And somewhere in the middle of it, a young woman had died in a carriage accident before she could stop it. Except Julian's hand went still on the page. Except she hadn't died. She was 3 rooms away right now, probably asleep, probably completely unaware that Julian had just spent 2 sleepless days assembling the entire architecture of what had been done to her family. He needed to find her, not tomorrow. Not after breakfast, after the ordinary courtesies, after Voss had been fed and watered and sent on his way like any other passing guest now. He found her in the kitchen garden at dawn. Early enough that mist still clung to the ground, early enough that the household hadn't fully woken yet, and Nora crouched near the herb beds, gathering something into a small basket, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. Baron lay nearby, watching him approach with the particular alertness of a dog who'd learned to read his master's moods better than most people could. "Your Grace." She looked up, startled by the hour, by the state of him. He hadn't slept, hadn't shaved, hadn't done anything except read documents until his eyes burned. "You look unwell. I need to ask you something. And I need you to answer honestly, whatever it costs either of us." Something in his tone made her go still. Basket forgotten. Hands falling to her sides. "Your Grace, was your father's name Edmund Winterbourne?" The color drained out of her face so fast, so completely, that for one terrible second, Julian thought she might actually faint. She caught herself on the low stone wall, knuckles white against the rock, and said nothing at all. Which was answer enough. "Nora," his voice gentled, though nothing in his chest felt gentle right now. Everything in him was a held breath, a coiled spring, 2 days of sleepless assembly finally arriving at the moment of truth. "Please, how do you know that name?" "My father knew him. They were friends. There's a whole correspondence, letters going back decades, promises made between them, a debt my father swore to honor if anything ever happened to your family. He even took in your father's Hound as a pup, years before any of this happened, because he already feared what Vane might do." Nora's eyes filled, fast, unstoppable. "Your father knew my father, yes. He never told you, he died before he could." Julian took a step closer. "Careful the way you approach something wounded and unsure whether it will run. He died still owing that debt, Nora. And I think I've spent my whole life unknowingly standing in the middle of a promise I never knew existed." She pressed a hand to her mouth, held it there a long moment, breathing unevenly, while Baron rose and pressed himself against her legs, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. "My name isn't Snora," she said finally, barely audible. "I know. You don't know all of it. Then tell me." He said it plainly, no demand in it, no Duke's authority, just a man asking a question he desperately needed answered. "Tell me what happened to you, please." And there, in the gray morning light, with the mist still clinging low to the ground and the whole house still sleeping around them, Eleanor Winterbourne finally began to tell the truth. "My father wasn't a careless man," she began, and her voice had changed, steadier now, though still threaded with something raw underneath. "Whatever the ledgers say, whatever anyone believes about how our family lost everything, he was careful with money, careful with people. He taught me to read a balance sheet before I was 12 years old. Because he said a woman who understood her own finances could never be fully controlled by anyone." Julian said nothing, just listened, understood somehow that this story needed room to breathe, needed to be told without interruption. Seas that usually shape a conversation. Reginald Vane was a distant cousin, barely acknowledged. Most years my father mentioned him occasionally, always with a strange kind of pity, because Vane's own father had been disinherited generations back over some scandal nobody discussed openly anymore. "My father told me once, when I was young enough to still find it merely sad rather than sinister, that Vane's father had been the elder brother, born to inherit everything, and had lost it all over a single disastrous decision nobody in the family ever fully explained to me. Reginald grew up watching cousins inherit titles and lands that would have been his by simple accident of birth order, had history bent only slightly differently. My father pitied him for it. I don't believe it ever once occurred to my father that pity might, in a man like that, curdle into something considerably more dangerous over 30 patient years of watching everyone else's fortune, while his own family's had been stripped away. When my mother died and then my father followed only months later, her voice caught, steadied. Vane appeared almost immediately, offering to help manage the estate, grieving along sorts, performing grief well enough that none of us questioned it. And the debts appeared within half a year. Enormous sums supposedly borrowed by my father in the final months of his life. I didn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I'd seen his ledgers, I knew what the estate could and couldn't afford, and none of it matched what Vane was claiming. She wrapped her arms around herself. Though the morning wasn't cold enough to explain the gesture, I started going through old correspondence, trying to find something that would prove the debts were false. And did you? Enough. Enough to know the signatures were forged. Enough to suspect Vane had been moving money through accounts my father never controlled. She looked up at him, eyes bright with old grief. I was going to bring it to someone, a magistrate. Anyone with the authority to actually investigate. I never got the chance. Julian's stomach turned cold. The carriage. She nodded. Slow. Mechanical. Almost like the memory still cost her something physical to access. It happened on the road to the county seat. I was going to deliver everything I'd found to a man my father had trusted for years. The carriage overturned before we'd gone 3 miles. My companion Marta, she'd served our family since before I was born. She was killed instantly. I was thrown clear into the trees, before the whole thing went down the embankment. You survived. By accident, by nothing more than luck and the angle of the fall. Her voice dropped quiet enough that Julian had to lean in to catch it. And when I finally made it back to what remained of my senses, I understood something with absolute clarity. If Vane's discovered I was alive, he would finish what the accident had started. Nobody would question it. A grieving, ruined young woman dead in a carriage accident that had already claimed her companion. Nobody would look twice at the timing. So you disappeared. I cut my hair, took my mother's old maiden name Wren, close enough to remember, distant enough to hide behind. And I let thou believe Lady Eleanor Winterbourne had died on that road, because staying dead was the only thing keeping me alive. Julian stood there, absorbing the full shape of what she'd survived, feeling something in his chest crack open that he didn't entirely have words for yet. Why here, he said finally. Why Kensworth Hall, of all the places you could have hidden? 'Cause my father told me, once, before he died, if anything ever happened to him, if the world ever turned against our family, there was one place I could trust completely, one friend who would honor whatever needed honoring. Her eyes met his steady now despite everything. He never told me your father's name outright. Just that the Duke of Kensworth had been entrusted with certain papers. Documents that might someday matter. The letters, Julian said slowly. He means the letters I found. Perhaps, I don't know exactly what he meant. I only knew where to come looking once I'd run out of other places to hide and Baron. Something shifted in her face at the dog's name, softer, warmer, the first genuine ease Julian had seen in her expression since the conversation began. She looked down at him, still pressed loyally against her legs. I never expected that, she admitted. I knew this was your father's estate, your father's house. I knew he'd taken in one of our hounds as a pup years ago before everything fell apart. I never imagined he'd still be alive, let alone still remember me after all these years. He never stopped waiting for you. I understand that now. Every strange thing he's done since you arrived, it all makes sense. He's the only thing in 15 years that's felt like coming home. The words hung there between them, quiet and enormous, and Julian felt the full weight of everything settling into place, not just the mystery, finally solved, but the woman standing in front of him, entirely reshaped by the truth of who she actually was. Eleanor, he said the name carefully, testing it. Watching her flinch slightly at hearing it spoken aloud after such years of burying it. I need to find proof. Real, undeniable proof. Strong enough to end this properly, because Vane is in my house right now, and I don't believe for one second he came here by accident. He recognized me. In the kitchen, I saw it in his face. I know I saw it too, then he already suspects. Which means we don't have much time. Julian reached out, hesitated, then didn't, closing the small distance and taking her hand in both of his, steady, deliberate. He felt her fingers tense at first. That old instinct to pull back, to protect herself from exactly this kind of closeness, and then slowly, felt her let it go. A small surrender that seemed to cost her more than anything she'd said so far. But you are not facing this alone. Not anymore. Whatever debt my father owed yours, I intend to finish paying it. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. Something breaking open in her expression, relief maybe, or the terrifying vulnerability of finally being believed after years of carrying the truth entirely by herself. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet. His voice was grim now, resolved. We haven't won anything, we've only just started. They stayed in the garden a long while after that, neither of them in any hurry to return to a house that's suddenly full of listening walls. Tell me about him, Julian said eventually. Your father, not the ledgers. Not the tragedy, him. Eleanor looked at him, surprised by the request, and something in her face softened in a way Julian hadn't seen before. He read to me every evening until I was far too old to be read to, she said. Poetry, mostly. He said a woman who loved language could never feel fooled by a man who used it carelessly. A small, unguarded laugh escaped her. He was terrible at chess and refused to admit it. I beat him for the first time when I was 9, and he insisted for years afterward that he'd let me win. He never once that's let me win at anything. He sounds like a man worth missing. Every day, she said simply. For 15 years, I haven't been allowed to miss him properly. Grief needs a name attached to it, Julian. I couldn't even say his name aloud without risking everything. You can now. I know. Her voice caught. I don't quite know what to do with that yet. Julian didn't answer. Just sat beside her in the cold morning air, Baron's head heavy across both their laps, and let the silence hold whatever it needed to hold. Vane moved faster than either of them expected. That was the trouble with a man who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of patience. Once patience stopped serving him, he abandoned it entirely, and what replaced it was something far more dangerous. It began in the library. Julian was away that afternoon, riding out to consult again with Whitmore about the strongest legal path forward, and in his absence Vane moved through Kensworth Hall like a man conducting a very quiet, very thorough search. Eleanor felt it before she understood it, the particular unease of being watched, of doors that had been left slightly differently than she'd left them, of a household that suddenly felt less safe than it had that morning. She went to the library herself in the late afternoon, following an instinct she couldn't fully name. Searching this time on her own account, because if Julian had found letters proving his father's promise, then perhaps there was more. Perhaps somewhere in this old cabinet, among the previous Duke's private papers, lay the final piece of evidence that could end this completely. She was 3 drawers deep when Sophia Kingsley found her. What? Sophia said from the doorway, her voice carrying the particular chill of someone who has just caught exactly the confirmation she'd been hunting for. Do you think you're doing? Eleanor froze. Papers still in hand. No good answer available, no graceful exit, nothing except the truth she wasn't ready to give this particular audience. I was looking for something, my lady. In the family's private papers? You're a kitchen maid. Sophia crossed the room, fast, and snatched the papers from Eleanor's hand before she could stop her. This is theft, spying. I'm not entirely certain which is worse, please. It isn't what it looks like. It looks like a servant rifling through documents that belong to the Duke's private family history. I don't see how there's another interpretation available. Sophia's eyes moved down, caught on something, the silver pendant which had slipped free of Eleanor's collar during the search and now hung visible against her apron, catching the afternoon light. What is that? Eleanor's hand went to it instinctively. Too late. Too slow. Nothing, my lady, that is not the jewelry of a kitchen maid.
It felt as sharp
and triumphant now, the sound of someone who has just found exactly what she'd been waiting weeks to find. I want Mrs. Pruitt now. It happened faster than a fire spreading through dry grass. Within the hour, Eleanor's small room above the kitchen had been searched, Sophia insisting, the Dowager Duchess reluctantly agreeing, the whole household drawn into a spectacle that felt entirely orchestrated even though nobody could quite say by whom. They found the pendant, already taken. Then papers carefully hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Eleanor had believed nobody would ever find documents bearing the Winterbourne crest, the name Lady Eleanor Winterbourne written plainly across the top in her own careful hand. Vane appeared just as the papers were discovered. Julian arrived moments after him, having ridden back from Whitmore's office at a dead gallop. The second word reached him that something had gone wrong at the house, but by then the whole thing had already assembled itself into a spectacle he couldn't stop. The great hall. Nearly the entire household gathered, drawn by the commotion, whispering behind gloved hands. The Dowager Duchess standing rigid near the staircase, Sophia arms folded, wearing an expression of vindicated satisfaction. And in the center of it, Eleanor Nora, still to everyone in that room except Julian, standing very still, chin lifted. The papers and the pendant laid out on a side table like evidence at a trial. Vane stepped forward. I know this woman, he announced, loud enough to carry across the entire hall. Or rather, I know who she is pretending to be. Said, arriving at the edge of the crowd, breathing hard from the ride. Choose your next words very carefully, my lord. Vane ignored him. This is not Nora Wren. There is no such person. This woman is an IMSA thief, in fact, who has stolen the identity and possessions of my late cousin, Lady Eleanor Winterbourne. A young woman who died, tragically, some 15 years ago. He gestured toward the papers on the table with theatrical disgust. I can only assume she found these documents somewhere and constructed an elaborate fiction around them. It would not be the first time a servant has attempted to invent a noble past for herself. That's a lie, Julian. Cert, is it? Vane's eyes glittered. Then perhaps your grace can explain how a kitchen maid came to possess the private jewelry and personal documents of a woman who died on the road to the county seat, buried in a grave her own family attended. The room had gone completely silent. Julian looked at Eleanor. Really looked across the whole width of that great hall, and understood that whatever happened next depended entirely on what she chose to do with the next few seconds. She didn't look away from him. He's right about one thing, Eleanor said. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that seemed to cost her everything to achieve. Nora Wren doesn't exist, she never did. A murmur rippled through the gathered household. My name, she continued, is Eleanor Winterbourne. I did not steal these documents. I did not steal this pendant. They belonged to my mother and to her mother before her, and I have carried them with me every single day since the night I suffered an accident that was supposed to kill me. Lies, Vane snapped. Convenient lies. Dressed up as tragic. The carriage did not overturn by accident, Eleanor said, turning toward him now, something fierce igniting behind her eyes. The wheel had been cut. My companion was murdered. I survived only because I was thrown clear before the whole thing went down the embankment, and I have spent 15 years in hiding because I understood, the moment I woke up in those trees, exactly who had arranged it, and exactly what he would do if he discovered I was still alive. The hall erupted into whispers. Vane's composure cracked just slightly, just for a moment, but Julian caught it, watched something flash across his face that looked far less like righteous outrage and far more like a cornered animal calculating its next move. Preposterous, he said. Too fast. I have documentatious official records. The death of late Eleanor Winterbourne was recorded properly, witnessed, confirmed by the physician who examined, confirmed by a physician you paid, Julian cut in. Or intimidated. I have spent 2 days going through the dates transfer records, Lord Vane, and every single document bearing your signature tells a story that does not match the one you're telling this room right now. Vane's eyes snapped to Julian, something cold settling into them. You have no proof of anything, your grace. You have a servant's fanciful story and an old man's paranoia. I have my father's correspondence with Edmund Winterbourne going back nearly 20 years. I have loan documents with forged signatures that don't match the real Earl's hand in a single stroke. I have a solicitor who remembers your name, your real name, Reginald Vane, not Voss-connected estate transfer that has never once made sense to anyone who actually examined it closely. Silence. Complete, total silence, the kind that happens right before something breaks. The Dowager Duchess stepped forward finally, her voice cutting through the tension, with the particular authority of a woman who had run this household for 30 years and did not intend to lose control of it now. Enough, she said. Both of you. Until this matter can be properly investigated by the proper authorities, not argued in my front hall like a theater performance. Miss, she hesitated, visibly too uncertain what name to use. This woman cannot remain at Kensworth Hall. The situation is too certain, too dangerous if even half of what's being said tonight is true. Julian turned to his mother. You can't be serious. I am entirely serious, Julian. If Lord Vane is telling the truth, we have a servant who has deceived this household for weeks. If she is telling the truth, we have a dangerous man currently sleeping under our roof who has already attempted murder once. Either way, she cannot remain here until we know which. Mother, this is not a discussion. His mother's voice left no room for argument. She will leave tonight properly, safely with an escort. And this matter will be resolved through the correct channels, not through shouting in my hall. Julian looked at Eleanor, waiting. Some part of him waiting for her to look back at him, to ask him silently to intervene, to stop this, and some other part of him, quieter and more honest, already understanding that whatever he snes would matter enormously. He said nothing. The silence stretched. Eleanor accepted the decision without protest, gathering herself with a quiet, wounded dignity that hurt to watch. She packed what little she owned in less than 20 minutes, and by nightfall she was gone. A carriage rattling down the drive with 2 of Julian's own men riding escort into the darkness. Julian watched from the front steps until the lanterns disappeared entirely into the dark. He could have stopped it. He understood that clearly, standing there in the cold watching the last light vanish down the drive. He was the Duke. His word could have overruled his mother's caution in an instant. He could have insisted Eleanor stay, could have placed his own authority between her and whatever danger Vane represented. He hadn't. He'd stood there, silent, letting the moment pass, and somewhere underneath the practical justifications, it's safer this way. The situation needs proper investigation. My mother isn't wrong to be cautious. He understood the harder truth. He'd hesitated. And that hesitation, that single unforgivable silence had told Eleanor something Julian desperately wished it hadn't. That when it mattered most, he hadn't been certain enough to fight for her. Baron broke free within the hour. Nobody saw exactly how the kennel latch found later, chewed and clawed until it gave way. Evidence of an animal that had thrown every ounce of strength he possessed against a barrier he refused to accept. By the time anyone realized he was gone, he was already halfway down the drive, running full out into the dark, chasing a carriage that had left over an hour before. Julian didn't sleep that night either. He sat in his study with the window cracked, listening for the sound of paws on gravel, for any sign that his dog had returned, and feeling every single minute of the silence like a physical weight pressing against his chest. I should have stopped it, he thought. I should have said something. Anything. Because that was so dumb, wasn't it? He'd found the letters. He'd assembled the proof. He'd stood in that hall and dismantled Vane's lies piece by piece, and then at the exact moment that mattered most, he'd let his mother's caution win out over his own conviction, which meant something, didn't it? About the kind of man he actually was, underneath all the righteous speeches. About whether conviction that only shows up in arguments and disappears when action is required is really conviction at all. He didn't have an answer for that. He sat with the question anyway, turning it over the way he'd turned over every document in that borrowed pile of ledgers, looking for some angle that made his silence in that hall forgivable. He couldn't find one. Every version of the story ended the same way: a man with the power to stop something terrible, choosing instead to let it happen, because standing firm in front of his own mother had felt, in that single unbearable moment, harder than simply enduring the guilt afterward. Rain started sometime after midnight. Heavy, steady, the kind that turned the drive to mud and rattled hard against the study windows. And Julian sat there listening to it, thinking about Eleanor somewhere out in that weather, thinking about 15 years of hiding finally undone in the space of a single evening, thinking about all the ways he could have been braver and wasn't. Baron returned just before dawn. Julian heard him first scratching at the front doors, a low, exhausted whine, and was down the stairs before Mrs. Pruitt could even reach the entrance hall herself. The dog was soaked through. Mud caked up his legs, his coat plastered flat against his body, the particular exhaustion of an animal that had run harder and farther than his aging body was built for. And in his mouth clenched tight despite everything, an old leather pouch. Baron Julian dropped to his knees on the cold marble, heedless of his own clothes, running his hands over the dog's shaking sides. "Where have you been? What is this?" Baron released the pouch into his hands, then collapsed fully onto the marble floor, breathing hard, done, having apparently spent every last reserve strength he had on whatever journey had produced this object. Julian turned it over in his hands. Old leather, cracked with age, and pressed into the flap, faded but unmistakable, a wax seal bearing the Kensworth crest, his father's seal. His hands were shaking as he broke it open. Inside, a single folded letter, the paper soft with age, and Julian recognized the handwriting immediately, his father's, unmistakably the same cramped, slanting script from the drawer upstairs. Except this letter had never made it into that drawer at all. He unfolded it with careful, trembling hands. "To whoever finds this, should the need ever arise, I am entrusting these words to a place I believe safer than any drawer in my own house. Because a man in my position has learned that locked drawers are not always as secure as they appear. Edmund Winterbourne was my closest friend for 30 years. I write this now because I fear deeply that his life may be in danger from the man he has trusted to manage his affairs, his cousin Reginald Vane, whose grievances run deeper than blood, and whose patience, I believe, is beginning to run out. Should anything happen to Edmund, I want it recorded plainly. Reginald Vane is to be held responsible. I have seen enough of the man's character across the years to know precisely what he is capable of, given sufficient opportunity and sufficient desperation. Should Edmund's daughter Eleanor ever need shelter, my house is hers. This is not generosity. This is debt owed to a man who once gave me far more than I could ever repay in ordinary coin." Julian read it 3 times before he could fully absorb what he was holding. Read it a 4th time, slower, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less enormous if he simply gave them enough chances to settle. They didn't. His father had known, had suspected Vane's danger years before it ever fully arrived. Had written this warning, and hidden it somewhere. Baron somehow still remembered after all these years, someplace from his own puppyhood at Winterbourne Manor, before he'd ever been sent to Kensworth, that the old hound had carried in his memory the entire time. Tucked behind the letter, Julian found one more thing. A small faded sketch. A young woman's drawing done in careful pencil stroke, a girl on the edge of adulthood sitting in the grass, one hand resting on the head of a hound barely out of puppyhood, both of them caught mid-law in some long-forgotten summer afternoon. Not long, Julian understood now, before the pup had been sent away to Kensworth Hall for safekeeping, and not so very long either, before the accident that was meant to end her life. Julian stared at it a long time. The young woman was unmistakably Eleanor, even younger than she was now, the same set of the chin, the same directness in her drawn expression. The hound was unmistakably barren, still gangly, still more puppy than dog. Julian looked down at the exhausted animal lying on the marble floor beside him, chest still heaving from the run, 16 years old and still capable of throwing himself through a storm for her sake, and felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with proof or documents or legal proceedings. "You went back for her," he whispered. "You went and found the one thing that could prove all of it. You did what I should have done hours ago." Baron thumped his tail once against the floor. Weak, exhausted, but present. Julian folded the letter and the sketch carefully back into the pouch and rose to his feet with a clarity that felt entirely different from the paralysis that had gripped him in that hall hours earlier. He was done hesitating. He didn't wait for morning proper. Didn't wait for the household to persist, his mother to offer her careful, reasonable objections, for anyone to talk him into patience he no longer had any interest in practicing. He ordered his horse saddled in the gray pre-dawn light, the rain still falling steady and cold, and rode out through the gates with his father's letter secured beneath his coat, and a single burning purpose driving him forward. He was going to find her, and this time he wasn't going to hesitate. The ride to the county road took the better part of an hour in weather like this, mud dragging at the horse's legs, visibility reduced to almost nothing beyond the reach of lantern light, the storm showing no sign of easing. Julian didn't slow down. He thought about Eleanor the entire ride, 15 years of hiding, of building an entire false self out of careful habits and buried grief, of watching everyone she loved die or disappear, and then finally finding a place that felt something like safety, only to have it collapse in a single evening, because the man who should have protected her had stood silent when it mattered most. "I let her leave." The thought kept returning, sharp and unbearable, every time the horse's hooves struck another patch of standing water. "I had the truth in my hands and I let her walk out that door anyway." He reached the coaching inn where his men had been instructed to deliver her just as the sky was beginning to lighten gray, reluctant dawn breaking over sodden fields, and dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, boots sinking into mud, coat soaked through. The innkeeper met him at the door, startled by the state of him. "Your Grace, a woman was brought here last night, escorted by 2 of my men." "She left, Your Grace, not an hour past." Julian's stomach dropped. "Left where?" "Didn't say. Paid for a room she never used. If I'm honest, sat in the common room most of the night staring at nothing. And then just before dawn she gathered herself and walked out into this weather like it wasn't even happening." "Alone?" "Alone, Your Grace. Wouldn't hear of waiting for better conditions either. Your men tried to stop her. She wouldn't be stopped." Julian stood there a moment, rain running down the back of his collar, feeling something that was half despair and half a strange, aching pride. Of course she wouldn't wait to be rescued, he thought. She spent 15 years learning not to need rescue. "Which direction?" he said. "Back toward Kensworth if I had to guess." She asked which road led there fastest. Julian was already moving before the innkeeper finished the sentence, swinging back up into the saddle, with a speed that startled his exhausted horse and a fresh burst of energy. Because if Eleanor was heading back toward Kensworth Hall on her own, in this weather, in the dark, with a man like Reginald Vane possibly still lurking somewhere between here and there, he needed to reach her before anyone else did. She was not running this time. That was the thought that kept her moving, one soaked, exhausted step after another, along a road she barely recognized in the gray pre-dawn light, mud pulling at the hem of her borrowed traveling dress. 15 years of running. 15 years of disappearing whenever a shadow felt too familiar, whenever a stranger's face held too much recognition, whenever the ground beneath her feet started feeling less than perfectly safe. She was done with, because sitting in that common room through the long hours of the night, watching rain streak down the windows, she'd understood something with a clarity that felt almost violent in its arrival. Running again would only give Vane exactly what he wanted. He had spent 15 years believing Eleanor Winterbourne was dead. That belief had made him careless, confident, comfortable enough to build an entire false identity and live inside it without fear. If she vanished again, now disappeared into some new town, some new name, some new careful erasure of herself, she would simply be handing him back that comfort. confirming, in the most convenient way possible, that Eleanor Winterbourne truly had no fight left in her. She wasn't willing to give him that. Not anymore. So instead of running, she turned back, walked alone through weather that soaked her to the bone, back toward the one place where the truth had finally started coming apart at the seams. Because if this was going to end one way or another, whatever the cost, she intended to be standing in the middle of it when it happened. Not hiding somewhere safe and small while other people decided her fate for her. The rain had eased to a thin, cold drizzle by the time Kensworth Hall's gates came into view. Gray stone emerging slowly out of the mist like something half-remembered. She heard hoofbeats behind her before she saw them. Fast, urgent, splashing through standing water at a pace that suggested whoever was riding had no intention of slowing down for anything. She turned Julian. Soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead, his coat dark with rain, riding like a man who'd left every ounce of ducal composure back at the house and hadn't bothered picking it up again. He reined in hard beside her, nearly sliding off the horse in his haste to dismount, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, just stood there in the drizzle, staring at each other. Two people who had both spent the entire night making the exact same journey from opposite directions. "You came back," he said finally. "So did you. I went looking for you. The inn said you'd already left. I couldn't stay there, waiting, not knowing what was happening back here." She lifted her chin, some of the old defiance returning to her voice. Despite the exhaustion written plainly across her face, "I'm done letting other people decide things for me, Your Grace. I've been running for 15 years, I'm not doing it anymore." Julian reached beneath his soaked coat and drew out the leather pouch, holding it toward her with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Baron found this last night." He broke out of the kennel and ran back to something from his own puppyhood, I think someplace he remembered from, before he was ever sent to us, and he brought back proof. My father's letter. A warning about Vane, written years before any of this happened. And a drawing his voice caught. "Of you younger." With him, Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the pouch from him. She opened it there, in the drizzle, and read Julian's father's handwriting with tears mixing freely into the rain already on her face. And when she reached the sketch, the young woman and the half-grown hound caught forever in some long-lost summer afternoon, she made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, entirely overwhelmed. "He remembered," she whispered. "This whole time, he actually remembered. He went and found it himself. While I stood that hall and said nothing." Julian's voice was rough with something that sounded dangerously close to shame. "I should have stopped it, Eleanor. I should have fought for you the moment Vane opened his mouth. Instead, I let my mother's caution win, and I let you walk out that door believing I didn't care enough to stand beside you. You're here now, that doesn't erase the silence." "No," she agreed quietly. "It doesn't. But it's something, and after 15 years of nothing, something matters more than you probably realize." They stood there a long moment, rain still falling thin and cold around them, both of them soaked and exhausted and entirely unwilling to look away from each other. "I have proof now," Julian said finally. "Real proof. Enough to end this properly. If you're willing to stand in that hall again and finish what started last night." Eleanor looked toward the distant gray shape of Kensworth Hall, gates just visible through the thinning mist. "I'm not walking back in there as someone hiding," she said. "I'm walking back in as Eleanor Winterbourne. Whatever that costs me." "It won't cost you anything," Julian said. "Not this time, I promise you that." She looked at him, something searching in her expression, testing the weight of the promise before she decided whether to trust it. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Your Grace." "I intend to keep this one," he said, "however long it takes." The rain stopped just as they reached the gates. Not gradually. All at once, the way weather sometimes breaks when a decision has finally been made somewhere above the and dist of the drizzle gave way to a thin, watery sun breaking through gray cloud cover, catching on wet stone and turning the whole facade of Kensworth Hall into something briefly, startlingly bright. Julian noticed it, filed it away as the kind of detail a man remembers on the morning everything changes. Eleanor didn't seem to notice at all. She was walking with a fixed, forward momentum that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with 15 years of accumulated resolve finally finding its target. Mud on the hem of her dress, hair coming loose from its pins, and underneath all of it, something steady in her spine that hadn't been there the night before. Julian led the horse behind them both, matching her pace, and neither of them spoke as the gravel drive stretched out ahead, wet and dark, leading straight toward the front steps where he could already see a small cluster of figures had gathered. Word travels fast in a house full of servants. Someone had seen them coming, someone had run ahead, and now as Mrs. Pruitt stood at the top of the steps, with her hands pressed flat against her apron, and behind her, framed in the open doorway, the Dowager Duchess. "Waiting, Your Grace." Mrs. Pruitt's voice cracked slightly on the honorific relief and worry tangled together in equal measure. "We didn't know where you'd gone. Your mother's been—" "I'm fine." Julian didn't slow his stride. "Where's Vane?" "Still abed, Your Grace. Or so we believe." "Wake him." Mrs. Pruitt hesitated, glanced at Eleanor, glanced back at Julian. "Your Grace."
Are you certain?
Julian said again, quieter this time, but there was nothing uncertain in it. The Dowager Duchess met them in the entrance hall, her expression somewhere between fury and fear. The particular combination that only a mother produces when her son has apparently spent the entire night doing something reckless. "Julian, where in God's name—" "I found proof, Mother." He held up the leather pouch, still damp from the ride, and something in his face must have stopped whatever lecture she'd been preparing, because she went quiet immediately. "Real proof. My father's own hand. A warning about Vane written years before any of this happened." His mother's eyes moved from the pouch to Eleanor, studied her for a long moment, the mud, the exhaustion, the rigid dignity she was holding herself together with. "You went out in that storm," the Duchess said. "Not quite a question, I had to," Eleanor said simply. "I wasn't going to let him win by disappearing again." Something shifted in the older woman's face, not quite warmth. Not yet. But something that looked for the first time like genuine consideration rather than automatic suspicion. "Very well," the Duchess said finally. "Gather everyone. If this is going to happen, it will happen properly. Witnessed. Documented. Not shouted across my hall like a common brawl." She turned and gave the necessary orders herself, her voice carrying the particular crispness of a woman who's had spent 30 years, making certain this household ran exactly as she intended. Whatever chaos happened to be unfolding beneath her roof, it took nearly an hour to assemble everyone. Vane, roused from sleep and visibly irritated by it, dressed with deliberate slowness, as though the delay itself were a small act of defiance. Sophisa summoned from her room, arriving with an expression that suggested she still believed she was about to witness her own vindication. The household staff gathered at the edges of the great hall in a wide murmuring semicircle, drawn by the instinct that draws any crowd toward the possibility of drama. Julian stood at the center of it, Eleanor beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Baron lay near the hearth, still exhausted from the night's run, but his head lifted the moment Vane entered the room, ears pinning back, a low warning rumble building in his chest that made several servants take an involuntary step backward. "This is becoming tiresome," Vane said, surveying the gathered room with the particular boredom of a man determined to seem unbothered. "I hope, Your Grace, that this early morning theater has some point beyond simply inconveniencing your guests." "It does." Julian's voice was steady, cold. "I've spent the last 2 days going through the estate transfer records for the Winterbourne family. I've read every letter my father exchanged with Edmund Winterbourne across nearly 20 years. And I've found more than enough to understand exactly what happened 15 years ago and exactly who arranged it." Vane's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I've already explained myself on this matter, Your Grace. I don't see the need to repeat." "You explained a story," Julian cut in. "I have documents." "There's a difference." He held up the pouch, withdrew his father's letter and unfolded it slowly, deliberately, letting the movement itself carry weight across the silent hall. "My father wrote this years before Edmund Winterbourne died. A warning, naming you directly as a danger to his friend's life. And should anything happen to Edmund, he wrote, and I quote, Reginald Vane is to be held responsible." A murmur rippled through the assembled servants. "A single letter proves nothing," Vane said, though something in his voice had gone thinner now, less certain, an old man's paranoia, nothing more. "Then, explain the signatures." Julian withdrew a second set of papers, the loan documents, copied carefully from Whitmore's record. "The debts supposedly borrowed by Edmund Winterbourne in the final months of his life. I've compared them against a dozen genuine letters in his own hand. They don't match. Not a single stroke. Forgeries can be difficult to prove or disprove without proper expertise, Your Grace. I'd hardly call your amateur comparison, then explain why every payment drawn against those debts flowed directly into accounts under your name." Vane said nothing. "And explain," Julian continued, his voice dropping now, quieter, more dangerous for it, "why the carriage that killed Eleanor's companion and was supposed to kill Eleanor herself had a wheel that had been deliberately cut, not worn through by accident. Cut. By someone who knew precisely which road she would be traveling and precisely when." "I have no knowledge of any such." "I do," Eleanor said. The whole room turned toward her. She stepped forward, chin lifted, meeting Vane's eyes directly for the first time since that day at kitchen. when a drop tray had first threatened to unravel everything. I was 15 years old when my mother died. 16 when my father followed her. You arrived within weeks, Reginald. Offering comfort, offering help, and within 6 months, debts appeared that I knew with absolute certainty my father had never taken on. Her voice didn't waver. I found the discrepancies myself. I was on my way to bring them to a magistrate when my carriage went off that road. A tragic accident, Vane said. But his voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely. I was thrown clear before the carriage went down the embankment. I watched it fall from the trees. I watched Marta die in it, because she'd stayed in her seat, believing the accident was exactly what it looked like. Eleanor's voice cracked, just slightly, on the name, before steadying again. I have spent 15 years believing that if you ever discovered I survived you would finish what you started. And now here you are. In this house. Recognizing me the moment you saw my face and pretending for weeks that you hadn't. This is absurd, I said. But he'd taken a step backward, and the room noticed it. A servant's fanciful story, dressed up with a dead man's letter that proves nothing beyond an old friendship. I have official documentation, records confirmed by a licensed physician, attesting to the death of Lady Eleanor Winterbourne 15 years ago. Confirmed by a physician you paid, Julian said. Or threatened. I intend to find out which, and I have every confidence the truth will surface once proper investigators begin asking the right questions. He lifted the slim file Whitmore had given him. The physician's report is dated a full week after the accident, Lord Vane. For a body that was never recovered, my solicitor has spent 30 years wondering why nobody ever questioned that. I intend to make certain some stuff finally does. Vane's mouth opened, closed again. For the first time since he'd walked into the hall, he had nothing ready to say. You have no authority to. I have every authority that matters in this county, Julian said. And I have something else too. He turned toward the doorway. Send him in. The old man who entered walked with a cane, his back bent slightly with age, but his eyes were sharp and clear as they swept across the assembled hall. Julian had sent for him the moment he'd returned to the house, a rider dispatched at first light to a small cottage 2 counties over, where Whitmore's records had finally led them. 3 days of careful searching resolving into a single name and address. Silas Whitfield, former steward of Winterbourne Manor, serving the family for nearly 30 years before its collapse and disappeared entirely from any record after until Whitmore, digging through old parish registries, found a pension payment that had continued, quietly for years, drawn from an account nobody had thought to question. The old man's gaze moved across the room. Found Julian first, then Vane, and something in his expression tightened immediately. Old fear surfacing even after all these years. Then Eleanor. He stopped walking. For a long moment, nobody in the hall moved or spoke, watching the old steward's composure crack entirely, tears spricking to his eyes as he stared at a woman he had apparently believed dead for 15 years, Lady Eleanor. His voice broke on the name. God in heaven, it's really you, Mr. Whitfield. Eleanor's own composure finally cracked as well, something raw breaking through the careful dignity she'd been holding since dawn. You knew all this time and you never. I couldn't. The old man's voice was shaking now. He threatened me, my lady. Threatened my daughter's position, her livelihood, everything I had left after your family's estate collapsed. I kept what proof I could. Waited for a moment I could use it safely, and I confess as the years went on I began to fear that moment would never come. Baron, who had been lying near the hearth throughout the entire proceeding, rose suddenly and crossed the hall at a pace that startled the nearest servants, pressing himself directly against Whitfield's legs with the same joyful, unmistakable recognition he'd shown Eleanor weeks earlier. The old man let out a broken laugh, resting a trembling hand on the dog's head. Even the Hound remembers me, he said. After all this time Vane's face had gone gray. This proves nothing, he said, but the words came out weak now, unconvincing even to his own ears. An old servant's sentiment. I have the account books, Whitfield said, cutting him off with sudden steady authority. Copied by my own hand before the estate transfer was finalized. Every payment. Every forged signature. I recognized the moment I saw it because I had watched the Earl sign his name 1,000 times across 30 years of service, and I knew the man's hand as well as I knew my own. He reached into the worn satchel he carried, withdrawing a bundle of papers tied with faded string. I kept them, Your Grace, waiting for someone with enough power to actually use them. Julian took the bundle, began comparing it page by page against the documents already spread across the side table. Whitmore's records, his father's letter, the forged loan agreements. Every piece matched, every single piece, assembling into a complete and undeniable architecture of exactly what had happened 15 years ago. and exactly who had orchestrated it. The hall had gone completely silent. Vane looked around at the gathered faces, the servants, the Dowager Duchess, Sophia standing frozen near the staircase, Julian holding 15 years of buried proof in his own two hands, and something in his expression shifted. Calculation, fast, desperate, and then he ran. It happened almost too fast to follow. Vane bolted for the entrance doors, shoving past a footman who hadn't been braced for it, boots slipping slightly on the marble as he threw himself toward the exit and whatever freedom lay beyond it. He made it as far as the threshold. Eleanor stepped into his path. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture. Just standing exactly where she needed to stand, blocking a doorway with nothing but her own presence, and something in her expression must have communicated more than any physical barrier could have, because Vane actually stopped, stood there breathing hard, staring at the woman he'd spent 15 years believing he'd erased. "You should have stayed dead," he said. Quiet, vicious. "I know," Eleanor said. "I thought about it often. How much simpler it would have been for both of us if I had." "Then why come back at all?" "Because you didn't just take my home, Reginald. You took my name, my safety. 15 years of my life spent looking over my shoulder in every town I ever passed through." Her voice had gone very steady now, very quiet. The calm of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment more times than she could count. "But you failed at the one thing you actually wanted." "And what was that?" "You failed to erase me." Julian's men reached him a moment later, 2 footmen and a groundskeeper. None of them trained for this kind of restraint, but all of them moving with the particular urgency of men who understood, suddenly and completely, exactly what kind of person they were dealing with. Vane didn't fight them for long. Something seemed to go out of him the moment the hands closed around his arms, the last of whatever confidence had carried him through 15 years of careful lies, collapsing all at once into something smaller and more ordinary. Baron, still lying near the hearth where he'd watched the entire confrontation unfold, let out a long, satisfied breath and settled his head back down onto his paws, as though the outcome had never once been in doubt so far as he was concerned. Within 2 days a magistrate arrived at Kensworth Hall, summoned by Julian's own letter and accompanied by 2 constables from the county seat. Vane's belongings were searched. Additional documents surfaced, tucked away in a false-bottom traveling case, copies of the forged signatures, correspondence with the physician who had falsely confirmed Eleanor's death, records of payments made to the man who had cut the carriage wheel on that road 15 years ago. The case against him assembled itself with almost mechanical thoroughness, and it carried straight through to trial before the season turned. Whitfield gave his full testimony, steady and clear despite age. His decades of careful record-keeping finally paying out in exactly the way he'd hoped they someday might. Whitmore contributed the estate transfer documents. Julian's father's letters provided motive, context, the long shadow of a grievance nursed across 30 years. And Eleanor, Lady Eleanor Winterbourne, restored fully now to a name she'd buried for 15 years, gave her own account before the magistrate with a composure that left even the most skeptical observers convinced. The physician who had falsified her death certificate eventually confessed, under proper legal pressure, to accepting a substantial payment 15 years earlier. The verdict took the jury less than 2 hours to reach. Julian watched the carriage carrying Vane away toward the county jail disappear down the drive, and felt something in his finally, fully unclench for the first time in what felt like months. "It's over," he said to no one in particular. Eleanor, standing beside him, didn't answer right away. "Part of it," she said finally. "The part that mattered most, I think. The rest will just take time." Julian looked at her, standing there in the thin winter light, with the weight of 15 years finally, visibly beginning to lift from her shoulders, and understood that patience, from here forward, would be the only currency that actually mattered between them. The formal restoration of her title took longer. Legal proceedings, land surveys, careful negotiations with the courts to reverse 15 years of fraudulent transfers. Whitmore handled most of it personally, driven by something that looked suspiciously like guilt for having missed the truth so completely the first time around. Eleanor's identity was confirmed beyond any legal doubt within a month. Winterbourne Manor itself sold off piece by piece over the years of Vane's management. Tenants and lands scattered across a dozen different owners would take considerably longer to fully restore. But the process had begun, irreversible now, moving forward with the particular momentum of justice finally freed to do its work. The Dowager Duchess could scarcely reconcile what she now knew with the woman she'd once dismissed as an unsuitable kitchen servant. "I owe you an apology," she told Eleanor privately. Some weeks after Vane's arrest, the 2 of them alone in the small morning room where the Duchess conducted her more private conversations. I judged you by your apron, not your character. That was a failure on my part, not yours. You were protecting your son, Eleanor said. I understand that instinct better than most people would. Protecting him from the wrong things, apparently. The Duchess's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, might have been rueful acknowledgement. He's been unbearable to live with these past weeks, you understand. Insufferably certain of everything. It's rather exhausting. I'm not certain that's entirely my doing, Your Grace. No, the Duchess admitted. I suspect that particular stubbornness runs in the family. Harmon, the senior footman who had once cornered Eleanor in the back hallway and called her a name he'd spent 7 weeks, approached her separately, some days after the trial concluded, hat twisted between his hands in a way that made him look considerably younger than his 50-odd years. My lady, he couldn't quite meet her eyes. I owe you an apology I don't imagine you're obligated to accept. You believed I'd overstepped, Harmon. Given what you knew at the time, it wasn't an unreasonable thing to believe. It was unkind regardless of what I believed. And I've thought a great deal since about how easily I decided what you were based on nothing more than an apron and an accent I couldn't place. He finally looked up. Baron never trusted me the way he trusted you, my lady. I used to think that was simply the dog being contrary. I understand now he likely knew something about your character long before the rest of us managed to catch up. He generally does, Eleanor said, and something in her tone let him know gently that the matter was closed. Thank you, Harmon. That took more courage than you probably think it did. He nodded, visibly relieved, and returned to his duties with the particular lightness of a man who has finally set down something heavy he'd been carrying without quite admitting its weight. Mrs. Pruitt cornered Eleanor a different way entirely, not with apology, but with something closer to quiet pride. The kind a woman allows herself only after 22 years of running a household exactly as it ought to be run. I knew, she said simply, one evening in the linen room, folding sheets with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. Not the particulars, but I knew from the first week that you were carrying something heavier than a kitchen maid's usual burden. I told myself it wasn't my place to ask. You could have asked. I chose instead to make certain nobody in this house ever had cause to treat you poorly enough that you'd need to explain yourself before you were ready. Mrs. Pruitt smoothed the sheet with unnecessary care. That felt more useful than curiosity, my lady, if I'm honestest about it. Eleanor crossed the small room and, before Mrs. Pruitt could object, embraced her, an entirely improper gesture between a countess and a housekeeper, and one neither of them commented on afterward, though Mrs. Pruitt's eyes were suspiciously bright for the rest of that evening. Lady Sophia's reaction proved rather different. She sought Eleanor out directly, several days after the news of the restored title had fully settled through the household, finding her in the same kitchen garden where so much of this had begun. Well, Sophia said, arms folded, her expression carefully composed into something that aimed for graciousness and mostly succeeded. It seems congratulations are in order. Lady Eleanor Winterbourne. That has a rather better sound to it, kitchen maid, wouldn't you agree? I never thought less of myself for the apron, my lady. No, I don't suppose you did. Sophia studied her for a long moment. I imagine this changes things considerably. Julian's attachment to you makes rather more sense now, given your restored position. A duke and a countess's daughter, that's a match society can actually accept. I don't believe his feelings have anything to do with my title. Don't they? No, Eleanor said simply. He knew me first with flour on my sleeves. I doubt. Sophia's composure flickered, just slightly. We'll see, I suppose. She left without further comment, and within the season had accepted an invitation to visit distant relatives in the north, a graceful exit from a story that had never quite gone the way she'd once assumed it would. Eleanor thought about her often in the weeks that followed, with a sympathy she hadn't expected to feel. Because Sophia's cruelty, when Eleanor finally allowed herself to examine it honestly, had never really been about malice. It had been about fear, the particular fear of a woman raised her entire life to believe that a good marriage was the only architecture available to her, watching that architecture crumble in real time, replaced by something she had no practiced strategy for competing against. Eleanor understood that fear better than most people would have. She had simply spent her own version of it learning to disappear rather than learning to perform. She never saw Sophia again after that spring. But she heard years later, through the slow drift of county gossip, that Lady Sophia Kingsley had eventually married a widowed baron in the north, with 3 children and a genuine fondness for poetry, and seemed by every account considerably happier for the change in scenery. Eleanor hoped it was true. Some grudges simply weren't worth the weight of carrying. Julian found Eleanor that evening in the same kitchen where everything had begun. Not working this time. Just sitting, alone, at the work table where she'd once shaped pastry by lamplight while he watched her hands and tried to convince himself he'd come for coffee. "You've been avoiding me," he said. Quiet. Not an accusation, just an observation. "I've been thinking." "About what?" She looked up at him, something careful in her expression, weighing how much honesty the moment could hold. "About what happens now, whether any of this, the title, the restored estate, all of it actually changes what's between us. Or whether it just gives everyone else permission to finally approve of something they would have condemned 3 weeks ago." Julian pulled out the stool across from her. Sat down. "I need you to understand something," he said. "And I need you to actually believe it, not just hear it politely and file it away as something a duke says to be kind." "I'm listening." "I didn't fall in love with Lady Eleanor Winterbourne." He held her gaze steadily. "I fell in love with a woman who had flour on her sleeves and knew my dog's real name before I did. A woman who corrected Mrs. Pruitt's letters and caught my horse's limp from 30 feet away and looked at me like I was a man worth being honest with before either of us understood why that mattered so much." Eleanor's eyes filled, slow and unwilling. "Her title doesn't change what I felt for her," Julian continued. "I would have chosen Nora Wren exactly as surely, if that had turned out to be the whole and only truth of who you are. You doubted me," she said quietly, "when it mattered most. You stood in that hall and said nothing while I was sent away." "I know. An apology doesn't erase that, Julian. I'm not offering an apology as though it fixes anything by itself." He reached across the table, not quite touching her, giving her room to close the distance or not as she chose. "I'm offering patience instead. Whatever time it takes for you to trust that silence won't happen again. I'll wait for it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes, weighing 15 years of learned caution against whatever was standing in front of her now. "Fear made me retreat behind my pride that night," Julian admitted, voice roughening. "I let my mother's caution win, because some part of me was afraid of what it would cost to fight for you publicly, in front of everyone, before I had proof solid enough to defend it. That was cowardice, dressed up as prudence. I understand that now. Baron trusted me with more courage than you did," Eleanor said. But there was something softer in it now, almost teasing, the first hint of the dry humor he'd fallen for in the first place. Julian agreed. And something like a laugh escaped him, unexpected and welcome. "Perhaps my dog simply has better judgment than his master." That finally drew the first real laugh out of Eleanor since her return, startled, genuine, breaking through the careful composure she'd been holding for days. "That may be the truest thing you've said all week," she said. "I mean every word of it." Eleanor sat with that for a long moment, watching the candlelight move across his face, weighing the difference between a man who apologizes because it's expected, and a man who apologizes because he's actually looked at himself clearly and didn't entirely like what he found. "You understand," she said slowly, "that I've spent 15 years watching men decide in a single unguarded moment whether I was worth the risk of standing beside. Vane decided I wasn't worth protecting, and it nearly cost me my life. My own instincts told me, for years, that trusting anyone with power over my safety was the surest way to lose it again. I understand that. Then you understand why this isn't a small thing I'm asking you to earn back. I never assumed it was small." Julian's voice was steady, quiet, entirely without the practiced ease he used in every other room of his life. "I assumed, from the moment I let you walk out that door, that I'd broken something that mattered more than any apology could immediately fix. I'm not here asking you to forget that. I'm here because I intend to spend however long it takes proving it was the only time it will ever happen." She didn't answer right away. Sat with it, turning it over, weighing 15 years of hard-won caution against the steady, patient certainty in front of her. Then slowly she placed her hand in his. Julian felt the whole weight of the past months settle into something entirely different. No young, no longer suspicion, no longer the careful distance of a duke and a kitchen maid, pretending not to notice each other. Just this. A hand in his, warm despite everything, offered not because a title had made it acceptable, but because trust, it's broken, had finally begun the slow work of rebuilding itself. "I'm not agreeing to anything yet," Eleanor said, though her fingers curled around his all the same. "Patience runs both directions, Your Grace." "I understand that good," she said, "because I intend to make you practice it." She made him practice it for the better part of 3 months. Not out of cruelty. Julian understood that clearly, even in the moments it tested him most, long afternoons spent in careful, patient conversation, rebuilding trust one small honesty at a time, neither of them rushing toward a conclusion that would have meant nothing if it hadn't been properly earned. He learned things about her in those months, that the mystery and the danger had never given either of them room to explore. That she hummed old, half-remembered tunes under her breath while working, fragments of a childhood she was slowly allowing herself to reclaim. That she still flinched, occasionally, at sudden movements near doorways, an old habit from years of watching for danger that would take considerably longer than 3 months to fully unlearn. That she laughed easily, once she trusted the room enough to let herself. He told her things too. About his father, mostly the man he'd barely known as anything beyond a distant dutiful figure, and the whole new dimension of him that had emerged from those letters. A man who had kept promises across decades, who had worried and hoped and loved his oldest friend, enough to write warnings he never got the chance to deliver in person, and generous enough to give shelter to a puppy long before he understood how badly that same shelter would one day be needed for the puppy's mistress. "I wish I'd known him better," Julian admitted one evening, sitting with Eleanor in the same kitchen garden, where Baron's wine over the silver pendant had first cracked open everything neither of them had been ready to face. "I spent so many years assuming duty was the only thing he actually felt toward anyone. Now I find out he was capable of this loyalty that outlasted him. Perhaps that's simply how some men show it," Eleanor said. "Not through easy conversation, through what they're willing to sacrifice when no one's watching." "You think I'm like that?" "I think you're learning to be something better than that," she said. "Which is frankly more than most men manage." Winterbourne Manor's restoration continued through those months, as well slow, methodical, tenants gradually sin-stated, land gradually reclaimed, the whole broken architecture of Eleanor's childhood home rebuilding itself piece by piece under careful legal supervision. She visited it for the first time in over a decade on a bright autumn afternoon, Julian riding beside her the entire way, and stood in front of the old gates for a long, silent moment before she could bring herself to walk through them. "It's smaller than I remember," she said finally. "Everything usually is. The gardens are overgrown, the library windows are broken." She turned to him, eyes bright with something that was grief and relief tangled together beyond separating. "But it's still here. After everything, it's actually still here." "So are you," Julian said quietly.
Eleanor didn't answer.
Just reached for his hand, and together they walked through the gates of a home she'd spent 15 years believing she would never see again. They found the old groundskeeper's cottage still standing near the eastern wall, weathered but intact, and an elderly woman came out onto its step at the sound of approaching footsteps, squinting against the afternoon sun. She went very still when she saw Eleanor's face. "Lord have mercy." The woman's hand rose slowly to her mouth. "Little, all grown, and standing right here in front of me, Mrs. Abbott." Eleanor's voice broke on the name, recognition flooding back all at once, a woman who had minded her as
Small.
who had bandaged scraped knees and told her stories about the manor's history while Eleanor's mother was occupied with estate business. "You're still here. After everything. This has been my home 50 years. Vane's men tried twice to turn me out. I told them they'd have to carry me off in a box, and they never quite worked up the nerve to try it." She descended the steps slowly, arms already opening. "Come here and let an old woman look at you properly." Eleanor went, and Julian watched the two of them embrace for a long moment, watched 15 years of grief and survival compress into something that looked, from the outside, almost like an ordinary reunion between an old woman and a girl she'd once minded. It was not ordinary. Juliet Chidneckler standing a respectful distance away. It was a small, quiet miracle, the kind that never made it into any official record of what had been lost and recovered, the kind that mattered more than any legal document ever could. "The tenants will want to know you're back," Mrs. Abbott said finally, pulling back to study Eleanor's face properly. "Properly back, not some rumor drifting up from the county seat." "Then let them know," Eleanor said. "I'm done being a rumor, Mrs. Abbott. I intend to be exactly who I am from now on." Word spread through the Winterbourne tenant farms within the week, and by the following Sunday a small crowd had gathered at the manor gates. Families who had worked this land for generations, who had watched it sold away piece by piece under Vane's management, who had assumed, along with everyone else, that the last Winterbourne had died on that road 15 years ago. Eleanor stood before them, Julian beside her, and found she had no prepared speech, no careful language rehearsed for the occasion. "I don't have anything grand to promise you yet," she said simply. "Only that I'm here, and I intend to stay, and whatever this land can become again, we'll build it together, the way my father always meant it to be run." It wasn't eloquent, it didn't need to be. The applause that followed was ragged and genuine, the kind that comes from people who have learned not to trust the easies, offering it anyway because something in her voice had finally convinced them. This one might actually hold. Julian proposed in the kitchen garden on a cold morning in late winter, with frost still silvering the stone walls and Baron curled nearby in his favorite patch of weak winter sun. He'd planned something more formal initially. A proper setting, flowers, some careful speech rehearsed and revised a dozen times over. He abandoned all of it the moment he found her there, kneeling by the herb beds despite the cold, gathering the last of some hardy winter greens into a basket, exactly as she'd been doing on the morning he'd first asked her about her father's name. "You're going to catch your death out here," he said by way of greeting. "I've survived considerably worse than a cold morning, Your Grace." "I know." He crouched beside her, unable to help the small smile that came with the memory of how far they'd traveled since that first fearful conversation. "I think that's precisely why I love you. You've survived everything and somehow you're still capable of kneeling in a garden, gathering herbs like the world hasn't tried to break you a dozen times over." Eleanor set down her basket, looked at him properly. "That's an unusual thing to propose with, Julian." "I haven't gotten to the proposal yet." Something bright flickered across face, half amusement, half something far more vulnerable. "Do continue then." He reached into his coat, withdrew a small ring, plain and unassuming, nothing close to the elaborate jewelry a duke could easily have afforded. "It was my grandmother's," he said before she could ask, "not extravagant. But it was given once by a man to a woman he actually loved, rather than one he'd been assigned to marry. I thought that mattered more than the size of the stone." Eleanor's eyes filled. "I've made you wait 3 months, she said, a small unsteady laugh threading through the words. "I've tested every ounce of patience you claimed to have, and I confess I did it partly to see whether you'd actually mean it. You said you would. You have. And you're still here. I told you I would be." He held the ring steady, waiting, watching her face for whatever answer was coming. "Whatever debt my father owed yours, I think I've spent this whole year discovering it was never really a debt at all. It was just an excuse to find you. I'd have found some other reason, eventually, even without the letters. You can't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I believe it anyway." Eleanor looked down at the ring, then up at him, and something settled fully into place behind her eyes. 15 years of careful caution finally completely at rest. "Yes," she said, simple, certain. "Exactly enough." For a moment neither of them said anything more. The frost held its silver on the stone walls. The weak winter sun did what little it could. And somewhere behind them a household that had spent months quietly rearranging its assumptions about who belonged where would soon have an entirely new arrangement to absorb. Julian found he didn't much care what the household made of it. He found he cared only about the woman kneeling in the frost in front of him, ring finally settled where it belonged, looking at him like 15 years of careful walls had finally fully come down. Baron, sensing something significant happening nearby, rose from his sunny patch and pressed himself between them with characteristic enthusiasm, tail sweeping wide, wholly unaware that he'd essentially just interrupted his own successful matchmaking scheme in progress. Julian laughed, real, unguarded laughter, the kind that had been rare enough in his life before all of this, and Eleanor laughed with him, and for a long moment the three of them simply sat there together in the cold winter garden, entirely, finally, unafraid. Before the wedding, there was one more conversation Julian felt he owed his mother, and one he suspected she'd been waiting for since the morning proof had first arrived soaked through at Kensworth Hall's front doors. He found her in the small morning room, the same place she'd once warned him about the cost of affection for a servant, and this time he sat without being invited, the way she had always done with him. "I wanted to ask your blessing," he said, "not your permission. I understand I don't strictly require that anymore. But your blessing matters to me, Mother, more than I think I've properly told you." The Dowager Duchess set down her needlework, studying her son with an expression that had, over the preceding months, softened into something Julian hadn't seen directed at him since he was very young. "You've had it for some weeks now, Julian. I simply hadn't found the right moment to say so. You were against this once. I was against a scandal and against watching a servant destroyed by gossip she hadn't earned. I was never against her. Not trustly. Not once I understood who she actually was." His mother's hands folded in her lap. "I watched your father spend 30 years honoring a friendship I only half understood the depth of. I think if he could see what's come of it, he would be considerably prouder of you than either of us has generally allowed ourselves to say aloud. I wish he could see it. He does in whatever way such things are seen." She reached over, rested a hand briefly on his. "Marry her, Julian. Properly. Publicly. Let the whole county see exactly what kind of woman survived what was done to her, and exactly what kind of man finally had the courage to stand beside her when it counted." The wedding took place the following spring. smaller than society expected, given the considerable scandal and vindication that had preceded it. No grand cathedral ceremony, no guest list stretching into the hundreds, just the small stone chapel on the Kensworth estate, filled with people who had actually earned their place there. Whitfield attended, walking Eleanor partway down the short aisle before formally handing her into Julian's care, tears running freely down his weathered face the entire time. Mrs. Pruitt sat near the front, dabbing at her own eyes with a handkerchief she'd clearly brought prepared for exactly this purpose. Even the Dowager Duchess, seated in the place of honor, watched her son with an expression that had softened considerably over the preceding months. Not quite approval offered freely from the start, but something earned slowly, through months of watching Eleanor prove, again and again, precisely the character her son had first noticed in a kitchen full of flour and quiet dignity. Mrs. Abbott had traveled from the Winterbourne cottage for the occasion, seated near the back among a small cluster of tenant families who had known Eleanor's father, and had waited 15 years for a reason to believe the Winterbourne name might still mean something worth celebrating. Whitmore attended as well, looking considerably less careful than his usual courtroom manner. Dabbing occasionally at his eyes with a handkerchief he seemed slightly embarrassed to need. Harmon stood near the chapel doors among the household staff permitted to attend, and when Eleanor passed him on her way in, she paused just long enough to offer a small, genuine nod, one that told him plainly the matter between them was fully settled. Julian, waiting at the altar, found his hands unsteady in a way he hadn't expected from a man who'd spent his whole life being trained not to show nerves in public. He'd stood before councils of tenants disputing land boundaries, before magistrates, before his own fierce mother. None of it had prepared him for the particular weight of watching a chapel door open, and knowing that everything he wanted was about to walk through it. Then the doors opened, and none of the rehearsed composure mattered anyway. Baron was meant to remain quietly beside his handler throughout the ceremony. He lasted less than a minute. The old hound broke free the moment Eleanor began walking down the short aisle, hurrying straight to her side with the particular joyful abandon of an animal utterly unconcerned with propriety, and sat proudly beside her gown for the remainder of the ceremony, as though he had personally arranged the entire event from the very beginning. Perhaps in its own way he had. Years earlier, he had been the half-grown hound sent away from Winterbourne Manor for his own safekeeping, carrying with him nothing but a young girl's laugh and the particular warmth of her voice, long before anyone else in this new life had any reason to notice the woman who would eventually walk into their kitchen wearing another name entirely. Julian and Eleanor left for a modest wedding journey 3 days after the ceremony. No grand continental tour, no elaborate itinerary, simply a fortnight along the coast where neither of them had ever traveled together, where nobody in the small fishing villages they passed through had the faintest notion who they were. Eleanor found that anonymity intoxicating in a way she hadn't expected. "Nobody here knows I'm supposed to be dead," she said, one evening, standing at the rail of a small hired boat while the sun went down orange and enormous over water she'd never once seen before. Nobody here knows I'm supposed to be anyone at all. I could simply be a woman on a boat with her husband. That's all, that's the whole of it. Does that frighten you? It did once. I think I'm only now learning it doesn't have to." She looked at him, windblown and unguarded in a way the formal portraits commissioned after their wedding would never quite capture. For 15 years, being unknown meant being unsafe. I'm only now understanding it can simply mean being free. Julian took her hand. Salt air and low sun and the particular quiet of two people who had earned, at considerable cost, the right to simply exist together without explanation. "Then let's be unknown a while longer," he said. "There's no urgency to go back." They stayed 3 days longer than planned. He had remembered her when no one else could. He had found the proof that saved her when human hesitation nearly cost them everything. And now, standing beside her at the altar with his tail sweeping slow, contented arcs against the old stone floor, Brent watched Julian slide a plain, inherited ring onto Eleanor's finger, and seemed, in whatever way a dog understands such things, entirely satisfied with the outcome of a mission 16 years in the making. Julian Kensworth had spent most of his adult life believing that duty and desire moved in entirely separate directions, that a man in his position could hope for one or the other, but rarely both together, and certainly not without enormous cost attached. He understood now how wrong he'd been. Because destiny, it turned out, hadn't waited for him beneath Verdantisings or among carefully bred ladies in crowded ballrooms, the way every lesson of his upbringing had insisted it would. It had been dragging him, quite literally, by a leash down a servant's corridor, and straight into a kitchen where a woman with flour on her sleeves was quietly rebuilding her entire shattered life, one careful day at a time, Waiting, though she hadn't known it yet either, for someone brave enough to finally stand beside her when it mattered most. He had failed that test once, he did not intend to fail it again. Standing at the altar with Eleanor's hand in his, watching Baron settle contentedly at her feet, watching his mother's careful, hard-won smile from the front pew, Julian understood that whatever debt his father had once sworn to honor had, in the strangest and most unexpected way imaginable, become the greatest gift either family had ever given the other. Not an obligation fulfilled, a life entirely and unexpectedly made whole. Baron lived 4 more years after that spring wedding. Long enough to see Winterbourne Manor fully restored, its gardens replanted, its library windows repaired and filled again with books. Eleanor chose herself, one careful shelf at a time. Long enough to grow gray around the muzzle and squat on the stairs, though he never once stopped insisting on sleeping across the threshold of whatever room Eleanor happened to be in, as though some part of him still worried, even after everything, that she might need defending again before morning. Long enough to meet the first Kensworth grandchild, a daughter born in the depths of a cold December, and the household staff still told the story, years afterward, of how the old Hound had refused to leave the nursery door for the better part of a week, lying across the threshold with the same rigid, watchful devotion he'd once shown a kitchen maid nobody else in the house had thought to protect. "He's decided she's his to guard now too," Mrs. Pruitt said, the first time she found him there, and Eleanor had only laughed and let him stay. Julian buried him beneath the old oak in the kitchen garden, near the low stone wall where Eleanor had once knelt gathering herbs while a much younger Hound rested his head against her knee. He had a small stone carved for the spot, nothing grand, nothing that announced itself to visitors who wouldn't understand the weight of it, just 3 words and a date he remembered first. Eleanor visited the spot often in the years that followed. Sometimes alone, sometimes with a small girl trailing after her clutching wildflowers gathered from the same garden beds, and she never once passed it without pausing, without resting a hand briefly against the cool stone, without remembering exactly what a stubborn, badly behaved, entirely unrepentant Hound had risked to bring her home. Julian told the story to his daughter eventually, the way it deserved to be told, not as a lesson, not as a moral, but simply as the truth of how her parents had found each other. A duke who had spent his whole life believing duty and desire could never occupy the same room. A woman who had spent 15 years learning that survival sometimes meant disappearing entirely. And a dog who had never once forgotten either of them, even when the whole world seemed determined to make them strangers to their own histories. He knew, Julian told her, before either of us had the courage to know it ourselves. Your grandmother spent 15 years believing the whole world had turned against her. And the one creature who never once forgot who she really was happened to be a dog too stubborn to stay properly leashed. Was he a good dog? His daughter would ask, though she already knew the answer. He was the best judge of character this family has ever produced. Julian always answered, better than your grandmother. Better than me, certainly, for a good while there. He simply couldn't argue his case in words, so it took the rest of us considerably longer to catch up to what he already understood. Eleanor, listening from the doorway more often than either of them realized, would smile at that part every single time, remembering a kitchen thick with flour and steam, and a Hound who had refused, against every command and every ounce of his own careful training, to leave her alone in it. Some loyalties, she had come to understand, simply couldn't be taught. They could only be recognized, eventually, by the people lucky enough to be standing close when they finally made themselves known. His daughter, young enough still to take such things at face value and old enough to understand they mattered, would only nod solemnly, and every single time, to hear it again from the beginning. And every single time Julian was glad to tell it. There was, he'd come to believe, a particular kind of grace in a story that didn't need embellishing to matter. He'd heard other men at his club recount their courtships with increasing flourish over the years, details sharpened and dramatized with each retelling until the truth became nearly unrecognizable beneath the performance. Julian never felt the need for that. The truth of it, a dog who wouldn't stop choosing her. A duke who nearly let fear cost him everything. A woman who survived 15 years of being erased and refused, in the end, to stay erased needed nothing added to it. It only needed telling plainly to whoever was willing to listen. His daughter always was. Because some debts, once paid, don't simply close a ledger. They become the story a family keeps telling itself, for as long as there's anyone left to listen.